Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first Regional Services Committee meeting of this term on January 23rd, 2019. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize this meeting is taking place on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish peoples. And with that, we'll get underway. The first item on our agenda is, Mr. Barry, the approval of the agenda.
Correct, Mr. Chair.
Are there any changes or additions?
No changes.
So with that, I'll ask for a motion to approve the agenda. Sorry, Director Nicholson.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about the agenda as it's presented. I know that staff work really hard to produce comprehensive reports, and there is a lot of complex material in on our agenda today. There are 19 items, when I counted, 19 reports, and I'm really concerned with the length of the agenda and really worried that we make sure that we don't shortchange some of the issues I think that really require some thought. And it's particularly challenging, I know, for people who are new to the board and aren't up to speed with some of the work that's gone on before. And I guess I would wonder and would hope that we could try and plan our agendas a little bit better, because I know that this is a budget type of thing, but there's an awful lot of policy work in here at the same time, and I find that very challenging, and I thought that comment needed to be made.
Thank you. I know during the agenda review that was shared by the members of the review committee, and we do plan to stay focused on the agenda items that are here. But if we need more time, we can always reconvene after the board. But well stated and noted. Thank you. So I'll ask for a motion to approve the agenda. Director Sebring, seconded by Director Marcotte. All those in favor? Opposed? Unopposed. Motion carries. Mr. Barry.
Adoption of the minutes from the Regional Services Committee meeting of October 24th, 2018.
If I can get a motion to approve the minutes if there's no changes or additions. Moved by Director Morrison, seconded by Director Staples. All those in favor? Opposed? Unopposed? Motion carries. Any business arising from the minutes?
No, Mr. Chair.
All right, we'll go to public input period. So the policy's up there on the board, and we'll ask those to step forward who would like to make comment. Welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. I'm Cliff Evans from Shawnigan Lake. Mr. Chair, on today's agenda, R10, Function 131, Environmental Initiatives. I go down to the core budget and I see Cowichan Watershed Society funding decreased from $50,000 to $0, as it is anticipated that the funding will now be provided through the Drinking Water and Watershed Protection function. So that looks very nice, and I think everyone would be happy with that. But then you go to R11, and it says the CVRD currently provides funding to 2 watershed-based groups. The Shawnigan Basin Society receives funding as a result of a public process for assent, and the Cowichan Watershed Board via budget line in the existing function. Clarity with regards to granting of the funds to external groups was discussed previously, and it is recommended that it should also be components of a function which was publicly approved to provide funds. So here we say we're zero funding someone, and then in the next sentence we're saying that we would like to have their funds. On page 2 of that, it says water and watershed management is a complex regulatory and public education mix, which includes a wide array of players from federal governments to community stewards, based on the limited resources and policy levers available to local government. This program will be most effective utilizing a partnership model where various players bring funding, technical capacity, and public policy tools to the table in either leading or supporting roles. So again, this sounds to me like you want the Shawnigan Basin Society and the Cowichan Watershed to come with their money, but yet in the Electoral Area Services Committee, they were funded zero. Existing watershed-based activities are housed in multiple functions at this time. Until the long-term strategy is developed, it is challenging to develop coordinated financial strategies to meet multiple objectives. And that is in R12, and I would agree with that, Mr. Chair, that it is complex and it's hard, and therefore I would like to see interim financing given to the Shawnigan Basin Society as it was voted in by the people on an AAP. And I'd like to see the Cowichan Watershed also get their money until this complex situation is ironed out by all you good people here. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Any other public input before we continue? Welcome.
Welcome. Hi. It's my first time doing this for a while, so bear with me.
Sorry.
Good morning.
Hi, go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Sheila Bell Irving, and I'm with director with the Shawnigan Basin Society. I've been involved with the Basin Society since its creation. I've helped restore 3 shorelines with Dave Bolster. I've been on walks through clear cuts and second growth forests with Timber West. I lovingly hand sanded our large old growth live edge table with my community that resides in our office in the village. I watched our office become a hub of activity during the contaminated soil fight while I was on the front line. We have always been about community and sharing our space. We are at risk of losing that space now due to the zero on our budget line. On January 16th public meeting, I watched the YouTube, and at 41.05, director says she has asked for a detailed budget the community can stand behind. We gave her that in December. We have received no reply. I asked what community did she consult. She goes on to say, to my knowledge, I've been working very closely with a research group. This society has not paid any water testing that has been conducted. Here's an excerpt from an email from Kelly Musselwhite dated June 13th, 2018. Good morning, Director. We missed you last night, but I also wanted to share that the SBS, Shawnigan Basin Society, moved to provide $4,000 to the Shawnigan Research Group to support their work due to the MOE by June 15th. Their support, of course, is meant to inform and influence how the minister will respond to the CR facility, removal of material, or closure of the site. Sending wishes for a peaceful day, Kelly Musselwhite. Here's an email to Director's husband of the SRA from Research Group member Dave Monday, June 13th. Hello, I've copied Kelly Musselwhite, who will send you a check for $4,000 as a contribution towards our costs for retaining Gary Hamilton Patrick Consulting Incorporated. This donation was voted and agreed upon by the Shawnigan Basin Society Directors Meeting last night. Can you provide Kelly with an address where they can send the check? The reply was, that's fantastic. This support is certainly appreciated. The check should be made out to Shawnigan Residents Association and dropped off at Doer's office. Director was CC'd on all these emails. We at the Basin Society are on the cusp of finding solutions to our milfoil problem through organo and nano bubbler, biochar, and floating gardens that shade out the weeds. We are applying for grants, and this has been hampered by our loss of CVRD support. This was a community voted on CVRD budget line of $50,000. The Eco Action grant is $100,000. That's a lot of support to clean the water and to become an example for what you can do and not what you shouldn't do, i.e. contaminated soil sites. Why is our director not speaking the truth and so focused on shutting us down? She wrote in her last email to the SBS, the community does not support this kind of misuse of funds. Huh? I ask again, what community did she consult? It's not like we're buying wood chippers and hiding 100-year-old scotch under our table. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bernie Yerlink, is this on?
Yep.
Mill Bay, but I also belong to the Shawnigan Research Group, and I notice in the budget for the water effort, there's $20,000 for this consultant, $20,000 for that consultant. And I'd like to point out there's a lot of expertise amongst the retired community here in the CVRD. So, for example, we have Dr. Linda Gregory, who's a member of the research group, who's a qualified professional on water issues. We have Dave Munday, another qualified professional on water issues. And incidentally, Dave Munday is also the treasurer of the Shawnigan Basin Society. You know, so I support the previous two speakers that I think these societies should have some funding, because this is a means to access, for example, the expertise amongst the retired in the community.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Ed Weeb, calling from Shawnigan Lake. I want to address some of the issues here, in particular drinking water and watershed protection group or the referendum that was approved. They're working on setting up a complete program for the lake. They've been on the ground. They are producing positive results and have for a number of years now. And I think that some of the funding that was taken away from them should be reinstated at least for 1 year, or as long as it takes for the drinking water and watershed protection group to be functioning and have positive results like the Shawnigan Basin Society. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further input from the public? So thank you all for your input, and we will consider that input when the appropriate items come on the agenda. So thank you for that. Moving on, Mr. Barry.
Yes, Mr. Chair, the next item, delegations. We have Robert Stitt from the Duncan Flying Club regarding an air transport study.
Welcome, Robert. Just before you get started, as you get started there, I was remiss in welcoming our alternate directors today. So welcome alternate director Ryan, nice to meet you, and alternate director Sandhu. I think that's all we have for alternates today. Welcome and thanks for coming today. Welcome, Robert.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, directors, staff. By way of background, some 18 months ago, the Duncan Flying Club put together an air transport steering committee. It did this because it's aware of the services currently being provided to the community by the Duncan Airport. It's also aware that that airport has a limited life for reasons that I'll explain in a minute. We also take note of the air transportation trends around the province, and we're also becoming increasingly aware of the long-term visioning and planning going on within the CBRD, notably the 2050 initiative, and more particularly at that time was the industrial land-based study that was getting underway. So we brought those ideas together, took those to Economic Development Cowichan through Ms. Melmark here. And this led to a presentation last August where we've made a similar presentation to the one I'm going to make in a second. We've since updated it based on events since then and input that we received from the community and some of the directors around the table here. And this resulted in a report by EDC recommending a study to look at air transportation in the valley and what the options might be. And that funding for the study was approved in, I believe it was September. And so I've returned to present to the new board to bring everybody up to the same place and to address some of the issues that came up as a result of the last presentation. So one question that came up was what's been the status of air transportation in the valley? So there have been a variety of private airstrips in the valley. We count about 12. 4 of those are still active, 4 in abeyance, 4 have disappeared over the years. There was once a company airstrip out in Poldy, which closed in the 80s. We have 2 float plane bases, the one that you all know at Maple Bay. There's also the registered waterplane base on Quamachin Lake. And there's the Duncan Airport, which is probably the most viable of any of those airports in terms of servicing the community. It was set up in the 1960s. It's active, but it's a very limited facility, and at some point it's going to be closed down because it's built on a gravel pit, which we'll take a look at in a second. None of those facilities, the ones that survive, don't have the capability to serve the community in terms of economic development and the public safety needs of a growing community. This is the existing Duncan Airport. It's owned by Butler Brothers, the gravel company. The Duncan Flying Club manages it, so it means we deal with Transport Canada. We provide briefings to incoming Medevac flights. We take care of the fuel supply. And between us, we've provided that service to the community over the last 50 years. The trouble with the airport is it's small, it's shrinking. There's a single runway, which is only 1,500 feet long. As you can see, it looks something like an aircraft carrier when you come in to land on it. The trouble is you can't turn it into wind, and so there's issues with crosswinds. The remaining area is very small. There's no space for future development. You can just squeeze in one Medevac helicopter when the conditions are right, which is certainly not all the time. And there's a steep, rutted road, often uncomfortable and not really suitable for ambulances, particularly in inclement weather and the like. So it's a marginal facility when it comes to serving the community in a meaningful way. Nevertheless, over the years, a number of services have continued to be provided. The first one is Medevac flights. There's a transfer going on here when both the CDH pad was closed and Nanaimo was fogged in, as you can see in the background there, so the helicopter came in here. BC Hydro uses it, the RCMP uses it for incidents, DND uses it from time to time related to search and rescue and other activities. A number of local companies do use it as a means of transportation to the mainland and other places. And the Duncan Flying Club, as I mentioned before, manages it, and we also conduct search and rescue flights from time to time when required. So there are a number of services at a sort of minimal level because they're constrained by the configuration and size of the existing airport. This is new for those of you who were here before, saw this before. So this is our network as it stands at the moment around Southwest BC. So we have Tofino. Just received $5.4 million to upgrade its runways. Bamfield, the local First Nations, has acquired it, and it's part of their long-term plan to support their economic development. Port Alberni, we have the Colson Company, who've set up an air tanker conversion company there. They're getting out of the timber business and getting more into aviation. Campbell River is now an aviation hub. There's more than 10 companies up there contributing to the local economy. We have the Courtenay Airport, Comox, which is now becoming a conduit into the Mid-Island. We have Powell River, which has just come up with a partner to redevelop the airport there after many years of sort of sliding downhill, so that's re-energized. Texada Island is a hub for the mine there. Qualicum Beach is an air transportation hub for light aircraft at the sort of charter level, 6 to 8 seaters that fly to all the airports around the area, except ours. Seasheld has a development plan for the future. Squamish has just hired a new airport manager and has put in for funding for a new runway and taxiways. Nanaimo, as you all know, is growing. It's heading in the direction of mass transportation. Flights now to Toronto, it's growing. It's got a big industrial layout there that it's going to be looking at in the future. We have Victoria, which we all know its story. It's doing transborder flights, has been for quite some time. So it's a hub too. And there's a gap, which is the Cowichan Valley here. We're not part of the air transportation network, both in terms of supporting business, responding in times of emergency. We have a highway to the north, which has a dozen or so bridges, which are not earthquake-proof. We have the Malahat, which we're all familiar with. We don't have access from the west in any sort of meaningful way, and we all know the challenges of getting on and off the island when you want to get something done, and that's not attractive to business companies who might be looking at the valley here to say, we'd like to establish here, but how do we get in and out of the place? And in times of crisis and emergency, we're in a rather unique position here that we're somewhat hemmed in. So if we were to have an improved air transport facility, that would give us, first of all, access to Nanaimo by air, which Nanaimo is designated as our earthquake preparedness hub for fixed and rotary wing operations to support our area. a link to Victoria, and then we would then have links to the mainland, Fraser Valley, and then down into the United States. And that's very attractive for companies that are looking for somewhere to set up. One of the first questions they're going to ask is, how do we get in and out of this place? And air transportation, rather than BC ferries, I'd suggest, is the way that they would want to go. So communities throughout the province are looking at how they can leverage their existing airports into something that better serves their business, transportation, and emergency preparedness situations. We've talked quite a bit there about business transportation and the attractiveness of having the ease of getting in and out of an area. Public safety is all about preparedness, and we've all been through that experience back in December. I think there's a huge awareness in the community that that was not pleasant, but it could be a lot worse in the future, and how prepared are we? And I would submit that air transportation is part of that, the jigsaw of solutions that are needed. One specific incident, going back to the helicopter.
Oh, sorry, my apology, I just bumped your microphone off there. I just wanted to remind you, you have about 2 minutes left. Will you need more time?
I think that'll be good. Maybe another minute.
Okay, if I see a willingness on the part of the committee. Okay, thank you, continue.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair. During the, this is back up at Duncan, two things about this picture that are important. First of all, the helicopter is using the runway to take off. So helicopters need space. They don't actually carry a lot. They're not the total answer to an emergency situation. So pilots actually like to have a runway ahead of them to take off so they don't run into a tree if the weather's poor. So having a proper land base with lots of hard standing to load and unload, medevacs or other purposes, is very important. So Duncan Airport's a marginal resource for that. The other thing is we had the situation where during the storm where the helicopter tried to land in the Cowichan Secondary School grounds, and their fleet of helicopters, which is our resource for medevacs, has these little wheels on it, and what happened was it started to sink into the ground. That's a serious situation in a helicopter, which is an inherently unstable machine. Helicopters like to have a solid base from which to fly. So we're asking to have this service, but we're not necessarily providing the alternates that are essential if you're going to have a reliable aerial service, in this case, particular helicopters. It's just one facet of air transportation I think we need to look at. And then wildfire suppression, I've got the statistics here, but I won't read them to you. But this recent study by UVic and Environment Canada says the fire situation is getting worse. We've got this big investment of new trees in the valley. The forest company is looking at how to make that more secure. One is looking at setting up a warehousing facility, a firefighting base in the valley. There's a lot of concern that we're not well prepared if there was a big fire outbreak in the valley. And we've talked to the air tanker supervisor, and there's definitely the opportunity there to have a base in times of crisis. We've got water all around us, which is a good thing in this case, because we would be able to come in with a retardant, contain a fire, operate off the water surfaces to control it. And I was in that business for 10 years, so I know what preparedness is about in the fire business. And finally, disaster response. Again, we're not part of that network that connects us to the outside world if something happens, Nanaimo being our designated hub in the event of an earthquake. The third part was really where we came in, which was having the opportunity to have land for light industrial. If that has an adjoining airstrip, that's a huge advantage. So what that might look like is an area with a runway into wind of a suitable length to be determined. Hangars, of course, a terminal building of some sort. The second pillar of this is to have a staging area, warehouse, helipad, that sort of thing, to respond in times of emergency along with the fixed runway to complement the helicopters. And where the money is going to come from operating this, in the main part, is going to be an industrial part where you can start to place these emerging industries that we're starting to talk about for the valley. So we have the key letters of support. They talk to the same subject, one from the Nanaimo Airport Commission, recognizing that we're not part of the network, that it's important. Air transportation is a vital link to those people who want to be in business and new businesses, and to attract investment, and to respond in times of emergency in a balanced way with all the resources that we would need. Very quickly, this is the last slide. Our steering committee, we've been working on this as volunteers for the last year and a half. We'll continue to work with EDC to build an air transport advisory group. We know a lot of the people who we need to be talking to get their input onto something like this. And we believe this supports the regional directions as defined by Cowichan 2050, picking out three of the key ones. That would be transportation, building the regional economy, a new economy, and being able to respond better to health, safety, and emergency planning requirements. Thank you.
Thank you for the update and all the work that you've been doing to this point. I'll go to the committee and see if anybody has any questions, comments at this time. Director Smith.
I'm sure a lot of people would be excited about further air transportation in and out of this area. I was just wondering, the land use, what is the zoning of the land at this time?
Of the existing airport?
Yes.
I believe there's 2 or 3 different zones.
Yes, it is. I'm president of the Duncan Flying Club, and we are on 3 different zones. Sorry? Yeah. We are presently on 3 different zones. There's an industrial component, a residential component, and a forestry component. And it's a mishmash in that regard.
Follow-up? The size of the aircraft, what would be the goal of the size? And then are there expansion options for into the future with the land that you're looking at with your proposal?
That I would respectfully suggest is part of the study. So we don't have a particular site in mind. It could be an alteration of the current site, potentially. That would be one option. It could be a new site. Location, size, all to be determined. So I think it'll come down to what this board would want for the community in terms of size. So what size of aeroplanes do we want to be able to bring in here to suit a certain purpose? We don't foresee this becoming another Victoria or Nanaimo. What we see is this as being a local hub that allows responses to the kind of issues that I was talking about there. But the purpose of the study would be to define all those things. So do we want 8-passenger airplane sizes being able to come in because it'll bring in a few tourists or support the industry here? Or do we need a search and rescue size plane to be able to come in here? So that's a different size runway, a different size piece of land. What are the other components and how big should they be? So that's really the purpose of the study, to start putting meat on those bones of ideas.
Follow-up?
Follow-up to the follow-up?
Follow-up to the follow-up. So I assume that you're working with Ministry of Transportation in regards to the obstacles that are within the area and the limitations of
Sure.
the approaches. and
Absolutely. That would be a key component, and that would be a component that our group would bring to the table because we're very familiar with those kind of topics, so, and could bring in the appropriate expertise to help. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Director Yanni DiNardo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Robert, and good morning to you. I really feel that this, for emergency preparedness, has really opened my eyes, especially after the events we've just had, and seeing it in the bigger picture and seeing how we can fit in. So I appreciate all your hard work on this and continued success.
Thank you.
Great. I have Director Wilson and then Director Marcotte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree entirely with what Director Yanni DiNardo just said. We do need something like this. So if I've got this correctly, you're looking for funding to create the Air Transport Advisory Group. Is that correct?
I'm going to defer to Ms. Melmock here in terms of the details of the study and the funding.
Thank you. Actually, what we're looking at today is an update because we're looking at the funding to conduct the air transport study, and within the context of that, it has been allocated within our budget for 2019.
Yep,
Yeah.
Director.
Yeah, refresh my memory. What was the figure in that budget?
Within that, there is a $25,000 allocation on behalf of Economic Development Cowichan, and we're hoping to fund that actually through the operating reserve for Economic Development Cowichan, because this is a one-off kind of project. It's a one kind of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the next little while. And so we don't see it as really part of the regular functioning. It's an additional thing that we would like to do because transportation studies are critical to economic development. But it's not something that we would fund alone. There's also an allocation from the Duncan Flying Club of $5,000, and we are seeking as well some private sector support to add to these funds.
Thank you. Yep.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. That makes things a lot clearer. Are there any other funds available through the province or through the feds or anything like that, do you know?
It's interesting. There's a lot of funding available for the actual infrastructure from the federal government and potentially from the province once the plan is developed and there's efficacy for that plan. The challenge is there isn't any money, unfortunately, for feasibility studies, and we have checked all the usual sources that we would look at, Island Coastal, etc., but they don't, unfortunately, supply money for the plan.
That's great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Director Marcotte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two issues that I think that need to be clarified. Number one is there a potential for expansion of homes, et cetera, and noise that is applicable to so close of a part in airport? So are we expecting any of that? And then the second thing is, I think I heard you talk about float planes. Is that correct?
Sure. Go ahead.
Part of the process would be a public consultation process, so addressing the noise issue. And it would certainly be one of the criteria for which site was proposed down the road once the initial study was done. So Transport Canada requires that there is a public consultation process, and they've sort of pushed that. They've said that, and then they pushed it back down to the local authority. So we would need to execute that process, and they do define how that should be done. So there is noise generated by the industrial activity on the site. There is the air traffic, which would add a certain amount to the local air traffic, which most of which is not connected with the Duncan Airport at all. Most of what we see is not. So does that answer the first part of your question?
Yeah, the years that it's taken Nanaimo to get that, the noise situation a little better than it is, and it's certainly not perfect now. People complain all the time with very good reason on the way. However, the planes, once they're in the air, they have precedence over anything else to be safe and whatnot. So there's a large number of people who are still very upset with the planes that have come so close.
Right.
And Nanaimo has done a good job, but not a perfect job. And as far as the float planes go, I certainly think that they are a possibility if we have the space for them. Did you mention Quamacan for that?
Well, Quamachin Lake has a water aerodrome there, which is in the flight supplement as a facility. What we're looking at is a land-based facility, so that wouldn't have a float plane component to it. Just going back to your first point, if I may, there's also a lot of work is being done by airports recognizing the issue that you raise, and so making sure there's good communication with the community and putting in procedures that do mitigate a lot of the issues by planning that ahead of time, where the circuit is, what the altitudes are, what the departure and arrival paths are. So there's a lot that can be done to actually minimize the impact on the community. And a lot of airports are only just realizing that they need to do this, and they're putting in place programs and online reporting and that sort of thing. And that makes a big difference. If people understand what the airplanes are doing and the benefits to the community, they tend to be more accommodating of any inconvenience that they might perceive.
Thank you. I just would appreciate that you keep that community input on it as much as possible.
It's top of our list, truly. When we think about this and how the valley is growing, and this would seem to be the time to do it, but it needs to be done with great sensitivity, too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you again for coming, and we'll be discussing this again, I think, momentarily. Mr. Barry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The first staff report from the Manager of Economic Development regarding the Cowichan Air Transport Study update. And I believe
Ms.
there's
Melmow?
a PowerPoint.
No, I do not have a PowerPoint. I'm here to answer questions if you have them on the report. I understood that that would be the process today.
Yep.
But I will say informally, this has been a journey for us in terms of looking at the air transport study and really reflecting on how this began. It was a conversation about, looking at the feasibility of the current location that's in Duncan right now, which is the Duncan Flying Club facility. But it's really grown from there to encompass something else, and that's just simply the need to look at air transportation as a central part of the economic function and the social function of our community. From an air emergency preparedness point of view, from an economic development point of view, and also in terms of just the way that the region is growing and how we can best accommodate that. I think this study is an opportunity to step back, actually, and consider this in a more holistic way. So when I say that the study has grown, it hasn't grown in aspiration so much as intent. And the intent of the study is to really try to bring information to bear that will allow us to plan effectively for our transport in this region in the future. And when the board talks about the need for community consultation, one of the things that we want to map out in the study itself is what that community consultation would look like. We are not as concerned with citing the actual airport as looking at the components that would go into that and the model that would make that most effective for the community and most viable for the community as well. Because I know the last time this discussion took place, there were a lot of cautionary notes around how are we going to pay for this and what are the best models for doing that. So this is a strategic activity that's going to take all of those factors into consideration, put them forward for the board's consideration, and also potentially for private partners, et cetera, who may want to come to the table for this. So I think it's a very important exercise at this point for the region.
Great, thank you.
Thank
Is there
you.
any further questions from the directors at this time? I'm not seeing any, so Mr. Barry will move on. Thank you, Ms.
Thank you.
Melmow.
Item R2, one of our first budget items today, the 2019 draft budget review. This is for Function 101, the Community Health Network.
So before we get into this, Mr. Elzinga, I just wanted to say to the directors, if it's the pleasure of the committee, if there are questions, before we move the resolution, just to prevent, amendments to resolutions or specifics, maybe we'll have the introduction from staff, and then we can have any discussion that's needed before the resolutions are moved and seconded. So it might just allow us to flow through the process a little cleaner. Yeah. Mr. Elzinga.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the budget in front of you today is for our Cowichan Community Health Network. I take this opportunity to introduce Cindy Lise, who is in the gallery today, to answer any questions the committee may have, as well as myself. And Cindy, I think most of you do know, is a dedicated person for this function. What is key with this function is there is no requisition. The function is completely funded by Island Health through the Cowichan Valley Regional District to our Cowichan, which is a network of health-related agencies. There is no debt payments, there is no supplemental request, there is no reserve funds, and surplus gets rolled over every year.
Thank you. A clean one. I've got Director Marsh and then Director Yanni DiNardo.
Yes, you wanted questions, though, before moving up the motion?
Yeah, if the committee has
Okay,
any
then
questions.
I'll
if
wait,
not-
because I was ready to move.
No, I think this one maybe not the one that will have too many questions, if you'd like to
Okay,
move it.
so I'd like to move the
Thank you, and
recommendation.
seconded by Director Yanni DiNardo. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? None opposed? We're off to a great start. Thank you, Mr. Elzinga. Mr. Barry? Oh, sorry.
So I have to recuse myself from R3 for the organization that I work for has a financial agreement with the organization being discussed.
Thank you. We'll just give Director Staples a moment. And Mr. Barry.
So item R3, it's the budget for the Victim Services, functions 457 and 459.
Thank you. And there are recommendations there. Is there questions from the committee before those recommendations get moved? I'm seeing none. Mr. Barry, the recommendations.
First one, that the 2019 budget for function 457 be amended to increase the requisition by $125 to the $15,000 maximum requisition limit. Number two, that the 2019 budget for function 459 be amended to increase the requisition by 1.5 annually for the term of the service agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Barry. Moved by Director Nicholson, seconded by Director Marsh. Discussion? Director Marsh.
I just wanted to acknowledge Cowichan Women Against Violence for stepping up when the Volunteer Society was unable to continue. And they're an organization.
Opposed? Unopposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Mr. Barry.
The next item, R4, from the Manager of Public Safety regarding the 2019 budget review for Function 109, Emergency 911.
Morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'd first like to acknowledge staff. Merrick Ryder is here, is our Emergency Telecommunications Coordinator. If there are any technical questions, highly technical questions, I'll defer.
If I can just get you to point the mic.
I'll refer to Merrick. As outlined in the report, Function 109 provides services for emergency telecommunications throughout the region in the way of fire communication services, ECOM, FireCom, radio tower, infrastructure capital projects, annual maintenance, leases, and licensing agreements. The function is funded entirely through requisition. There are a couple of increases here for the year, collaborating to a 2% increase of approximately $19,906.
Thank you. Questions from the committee? Director Sebring.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just note the lease fees at Mount Sicker. To whom are we paying those leases? Is that still Environment Canada that owns that site, or?
Environment Canada, we're in a migration stage right now where Environment Canada is moving out and RCMP is moving in as the primary operator of that facility, and the lease fees are projected at this point. We've been informed there will be lease fees, so it's effectively a placeholder for those.
That's what I was wondering, because I hear that the Doppler radar is gone. That's why I wondered who was running.
The migration is currently taking place. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Director Smith.
Thank you. I notice that the date of the budget here is November 7th, 2018, and the surplus for 2018. Do you have a better update for us for the surplus funds that are available at the end of 2018? As these are not they're not current.
So through to staff.
Through to staff.
Not clear. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Mr. Chair, if I may assist, this may be a better question for finance, my understanding, and they're working on that number right now. So obviously the surplus is projected when the budget is created, and so there hasn't been an update since that time.
So would this not be an operating reserve from the function, however?
So any surplus from the year would be transferred into operating reserve. But I don't have that surplus number at my hand, and looking from finance, I'm not sure they do either.
Through the chair to the director, yes, at this time, finance is still working on finalizing those numbers and won't have those finalized numbers at this point in time.
Thank you. And as is the policy, the operating reserve surplus at the end of the year would be transferred into operating reserve. So I remember having this discussion at our Corporate Services Committee a week ago. So I'm not sure if staff feels they can get that right now, but no, because we're still compiling the year ends, but the policy is to take those surpluses and put them into the operating reserve. Follow-up, Director Smith.
With the operating reserves, is it not possible to use operating reserves for budget items? There's an increase for the maintenance of the 911 equipment. Would that not fall under something that those operating reserves could be spent on?
Thank you. Maybe if I could go through to staff just to explain the operating reserve policy again so that we don't get hung up on that throughout the day.
Through the chair to the director, yeah, the operating reserve policy is, the operating reserve, the funds are meant for one-time use, not for ongoing costs. So they're used to offset shortfalls in, say, revenues, one-time unforeseen expenditures, those type of things, not for the ongoing maintenance of a function or operating. The target for the operating reserves is to have a minimum of 2 months and a maximum of 2 months. Or 4 months, sorry.
Thank you. And so the resolution or the analysis here does it dictate some increase to replenish that reserve? Because my understanding is the estimates are that the surplus would not be adequate at this time to have that reserve as per the policy.
Correct.
Thank you. Through to Director Nicholson.
Yeah, I think that's the important point, is what should the operating reserve be, and where are we in relation to that?
I'm not sure I can provide any more clarity, but again, through the
Through the chair to the
staff.
director, currently we have an operating reserve of 143,000. The maximum for this service would be 321. So it's in the middle of that, it's right in the spot where we'd want it at this point in time.
So it's just at the minimum level, basically, right now that's recommended for that function. Thank you. I don't see any more questions. Mr. Barry, has it been moved and seconded yet?
No, and there is a recommendation that the 2019 budget for Function 109, Emergency 911, be approved.
Moved by Director Marcotte, seconded by Director Staples. Discussion? We've already had it. Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed? None opposed. Motion carries. Moving on, Mr. Barry.
The next budget, also from Public Safety, regarding Function 205, Emergency Planning.
Thank you. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Jason DeJong, our Fire Rescue Services Coordinator, who I'll defer to once again if we have any highly technical questions in the field of fire rescue services. As outlined in the report, Function 205 is for emergency planning. The function provides emergency management through its partner municipalities and First Nations. Core expenditures include emergency management mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery, emergency communications, emergency social services, local emergency response, neighborhood programs, search and rescue, fire rescue coordination, and public education. The function is funded through requisition, allocations, and sales of services to First Nations. As you can see, there's a 2% projected increase, totaling $15,538, comprised of a variety of increases and decreases as outlined in the report. There is a supplemental request here for a sprinkler protection unit, SPU, of $180,000.
Thank you.
I'll stop there.
Thank you. To the committee, Director Marcotte.
Thank you. I've seen that to be a very effective thing in some of the meetings that I have met with people, that these actually shown how to use those tools, and therefore I would like to move the motion.
So it's been moved by Director Marcotte, seconded by Director Sebring. And discussion, I've got Director Morrison and Nicholson and Sebring.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to perhaps Mr. DeJong, but we'll hear what Mr. Gervais has to say. In reading this report, I concur with Director Marcotte on the efficacy of the sprinkler units, and I've been looking to bring that into our communities for an awful long time, and I'm thrilled to see it here. One thing I didn't see in the report, though, was the fact that these units can, in circumstances where we're not at risk, provide revenue opportunities for us. So is there a rate that that can be expected if there's other communities that are interested in making use of this sprinkler unit?
Through the chair to the director, firstly, before I turn it over to Mr. DeJong, you've outlined a component of it which is critical to our submission of the report, and that's the projected revenue. If the board is not aware, the Office of the Fire Commissioner on an annual basis, when there are wildfire events throughout the province, puts out requests to local governments, private industry to provide firefighting equipment, including SPU units, to be deployed to fire-ravaged areas. And there is a revenue mechanism for that, clearly outlined in an agreement with the Office of the Fire Commissioner and the provider of the service. It's substantial in nature in terms of the revenue. It's not nickels and dimes. It's dollars, significant dollars, and that's as Director Morrison's pointed out. It would be we would only deploy the equipment if there was a low risk here in our local area. So in terms of the actual dollar amounts, do you have that? Okay.
Welcome, Mr. DeJong.
Thank you. As Mr. Gervais mentioned, that the Office of the Fire Commissioner does set these rates through the Ministry of Forests. Typically, a deployed rate is an all-found rate on a 12-hour day. If it's with personnel, it's up to close to $8,000 a day. You could send the unit without personnel. Unopened, it's $6,400 a day. It could also be requested to be a standby at your home station, which is $1,700 a day. So there is a prescribed matrix for this mechanism. So when it is deployed with personnel, there is significant revenue there.
Great, thank you. Moving on to Director Nicholson and then Sebring.
I'm interested in the reserves, whether we're on target for the operating reserve, and I noticed that we've decreased by $5,500 to minor capital and capital reserve transfer. So what should we have in a capital reserve for this function?
Thank you. Through to staff.
So we do not set minimums and maximums for the capital reserve. For the operating reserve, this function is currently right on target. So they're right at the 2-month level.
Okay. So the policy is 2 to 4 months, but we're at the 2-month level presently.
2-month level right
Thank
now.
you. Yeah, if there's a comment on the capital reserve.
I have no comment other than there's a slight decrease projected there.
Follow-up?
So my follow-up then would be, is $105,000 reasonable to have in a capital reserve for this kind of a business that we're trying to do here?
Capital reserves have been used in public safety largely to fund apparatus, building infrastructure improvements or renewals, which have come with very high costs. So I would say that $105 is at the very low end of where we would like to be.
105,000.
105,000 for the function. Thank you.
Public safety apparatus do tend to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars at times.
$500,000, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Director Nicholson.
Right, so I'm wondering if it is prudent to decrease our transfer to capital reserves.
Or from capital reserves, you mean? Or to?
Well, it says a $5,500 decrease in minor capital and transfer to capital reserves.
So maybe I'll refer to Talitha. So the decrease is expenditures projected in the line item for the year. So it's an effort on our part to try to balance the budget.
So there's actually spending from the reserve this year of $5,500.
there's a decrease in spending in minor capital projected for 2019.
From 2018?
Yes.
Thank you. I have another and then I'll go to Director Sebring.
So my understanding is we should try and have a capital reserve, and that and it's part of our budget, there is a certain amount we should be targeting to put in every year to keep our capital reserve at a level that we think will cover our capital expenditures on an ongoing basis. So I know we don't have good figures on what we should have in our capital reserves, but until we have those good figures, it seems to me that we should continue at the same level of putting money in or that we have.
I'll go back to our finance staff for some clarity.
Through the chair to Director Nicholson, there is $5,000 that's actually being transferred into the capital reserve that wasn't budgeted for. That's what's in this amount. It wasn't budgeted last year, so there's actually $5,000 going in, okay? And the plan is to tie the capital reserve policy to the asset management plan when we get to it.
Thank you. Director Sebring.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So basically what that line means is we're decreasing the spending by 5,500 and putting that into the capital reserve. That, I think, maybe was the source of confusion. I want to go back to the sprinkler protection unit on the premise that there's no such thing as a dumb question. Nowhere in this report has been identified for me what a sprinkler protection unit is. I gather it has something to do with forest firefighting and we can lend it to the province, but what are we actually spending this money on? What is this $180,000 unit? Is it sit on the back of a truck? What is it?
Thank you, Mr.
Through the
Gervais.
chair to the director. So a sprinkler, thank you for the question. The sprinkler protection unit is there's various types of them. The one that we are looking to purchase is what's called a Type 2, and it's basically categorized by the size and volume of resources that are on board. It is effectively a mobile firefighting center to protect residential infrastructure in an interface fire situation. So a variety of sprinklers, hoses, pumps, generators, that type of equipment. And it is it's a mobile unit.
Thank you, because I looked at this and went, what building are we putting sprinklers in? I mean, there was no context for me, so.
Thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any further speakers on the list. It has been moved and seconded, so we'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Unopposed? Motion carries. Mr. Berry.
R6 from the Manager Economic Development regarding the 2019 budget review for Function 123, Regional Tourism Services.
Do you have any introduction, Ms. Melmock, or do we just go to questions from the committee?
I'll give a brief introduction. This is a function that has been at the same level for many years, and it's not within this budget destined to increase. It's the same budget as it has been for the past decade, and it's quite a simple budget, really. It's a requisition that is put forward to support destination marketing, and there's explanation within the report in how that requisition is currently used by a Tourism Cowichan Society. And Tourism Cowichan will be coming forward with their work plan in February to illustrate how it's going to be using the requisition this year.
Thank you. So to Director Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Tourism for Cowichan Society, that is the $117,000 which has been requisitioned on the Vadim report?
Yes. Well, at this point, the requisition is a requisition that the CVRD puts aside every year for tourism marketing services. That function used to come through Economic Development Cowichan, and about, I believe, 3 years ago, we began to form a relationship to take that function out of Economic Development Cowichan and give it to an industry-led association. And so that requisition is now given to Tourism Cowichan. They take that funding and they, in fact, triple it, or more, actually, because their budget is now reaching the $900,000 level. So they're able to take that and leverage that funding through the province through the destination marketing program. And they've also worked with the CVRD to take advantage of the MRDT program, which is the taxation program on accommodations. And so we transfer that resource to them as well.
Follow up. Yeah, I was going to ask about the MRDT. I see that they were they were granted $284,000 from, I'm not sure where that came from. So what was that payment of $284,000,
yeah.
and what does the MRDT actually do?
Sure. It's actually a provincial tax that is levied on accommodation providers in the region. It was a very detailed process to get the MRDT in place. We had to actually prove in the region that at least 70% of the accommodation providers were in favor of that tax. So there was extensive consultation done, again, about 2 years ago, just before I came on board, actually, and the MRDT was approved by this board, and then it was put in place. So what happens is the funds are transferred to the province, and then the province, about every 2 months or so, they give us a report saying, this is how much has been collected. We're forwarding it into the CVRD's bank account, and we forward it to Tourism Cowichan Society.
So we give it to them.
We're the
and they give it
flow-through
back to us.
organization, yes, and they
Okay.
spend it on destination marketing.
And that's the same for the 2019 400,000 K, that will go
That's
to
right.
them and then
Yeah.
flow back to us again?
Yes.
Okay, one final question, if that's okay. These are the societies that the money's given to.
Mm-hmm.
Are there financial reports available? Do we get financial reports?
Yes, we do.
for
It's
oversight?
actually a function of the agreement that we have with Tourism Cowichan to receive that annual financial report. And they do it as a process of reporting on the MRDT and as well as a function of bringing their work plan forward to the board.
And that will happen in February?
Yes.
Yeah, so they give us a
Again.
wrap-up of previous year's activities, what the metrics are, and then the plan for the coming year.
And that's actually a financial report as...
It includes the full financial
Okay,
report.
thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, their presentation doesn't go through that in detail, but we are provided with it. Thank you. All right, seeing
Thank
no
you.
further questions to the resolution, Mr. Barry.
The recommendation, Function 123, Regional Tourism Services Draft Budget for 2019 be approved.
Moved by Director Morrison, seconded by Director Sebring. Seeing no more hands for discussion, I will call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? None opposed. Motion carries. Thank you, Ms. Milmuck. Don't go away.
I'm not going to go away.
Since she's standing there, R7, Manager Economic Development, regarding Function 121, the Economic Development Draft Budget.
Thank you. Would you like to make any introduction here or just go to the question?
Yes, I would actually, because as simple as the tourism budget is, this one is actually in degrees much more complicated. So I would like to have an opportunity just to walk the directors through the budget a little bit. In terms of the overall budget itself, it actually has gone down this year. We've made an effort to be fiscally prudent and to bring the budget down to the best effect that we can. There is within our budget a rather interesting construct because we also encompass sport tourism. So annually, the budget for sport tourism can be anywhere between $70,000 and $130,000, depending on if there's special projects within sport tourism. So the reason that sport tourism appears in our budget is because we are one of the only regional functions, and it was felt in a board gone past, and it was before I came to the organization as well, that it would be effective to put the sport tourism budget within our budget. I don't have a quarrel with that, and I work as best I can with John Elzinga to talk about the budget and to collaborate. But really, it is a function of a separate function that John manages and looks after and does a great job of bringing forward for the region. And they did some major projects this year, the hockey tournament and actually the BC Summer Games were in their budget this year. So there were two major programs that they initiated that have since gone down considerably this year. So you see, as part of our budget, a shrinking budget for sport tourism. And so that's one of the reasons that the budget has gone down, effectively because special projects like that have been completed. We have also tried to work effectively to leverage over the last few years in terms of what we bring to the budget in terms of resources from other areas. So one of the areas that I hope that the board is seeing and appreciating that it's increasing is the notion of leveraging funding from other sources for special projects. So we've consistently built up the resources for provincial initiatives, and our budget this year is increasing from about 32,000 to 48,000 for projects that we're conducting on behalf of the communities, with ICE-T funding that we're getting, and hopefully some rural dividend funding as well for a tech training initiative that we would like to initiate. So that's gone up. And we have requested only 2 supplementals, although in our original application, there was application for 4 supplementals. We've reduced that number to 2 to be fiscally prudent and to focus what we feel is most relevant for our region. One is a supplemental to continue the good work that we've done through having an additional staff member on board to help with projects, Janae Enns, who's here today. And through having that support, it's been a tremendous asset to us to be able to leverage funding for communities and to work on special projects that we've wanted to advance. So we put that forward as our #1 priority. And as a second priority, the notion of developing a regional accommodations strategy. And that's something that's been on the books for some time. It poses, I think, a great opportunity for our region to identify the accommodation that's possible. Just the rumor that we're actually going to do the study has resulted in my phone ringing and people saying, we really want to talk about bringing people to the region. I know that's of paramount concern for the municipalities in the region as well as for some of our areas. So I think that's an important project. I won't say more, but if there are questions, I would be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll turn to the committee. I've got Director Wilson, and then Director Nicholson, and Smith. Director Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's a couple of discrepancies which I'm not quite sure of
Sure.
here.
And maybe finance can help me in that regard.
Yeah, the year over year doesn't line up with the staff report. There are different numbers in there.
Yeah.
For instance, the year over year quotes $215,611.
Mm-hmm.
The VADIM, if you add up the numbers in there, it comes to 241,000.
Okay.
And then there's a number in the staff report of 237,000 from 271. So there's all these numbers flying around.
Yes.
Which really don't coincide with each other.
There was a lot of toing and froing, I admit, with finance this year on some of the numbers because we were making changes to the budget as instructed over time with the budget. And so what line item are you specifically speaking of, Director Wilson?
Let's go to the VADIM report.
Okay.
If I'm pronouncing that correctly.
VADIM, I think.
VADIM? Okay. We've got operating expenditures. You've got a number of 15,500 in wages hourly. Then you've got 185 in wages. And then there's another 46,000 in benefits. If you add those 3 up, that comes to 241, 242,000, but as I say, the year upon year has a number of 215,000.
So it's a discrepancy between the year over year. I think that's something that perhaps we didn't catch, or can I have Talitha, would you like to weigh in there?
Through the chair, there are also wages and benefits in the sport tourism category further down on your VADIM report. So the year over year summarizes the entire budget and it lumps all of the wages and benefits together in one
There's the
line.
discrepancy.
But they're split within the VADIM report, so you have to actually move from line to line.
Well, look,
Yep.
so that 20,000 in the sports tourism needs to be added onto the year on year?
It's included in the year over year when you, the total benefits is of all the wages and benefits throughout the VADM report is added together and included in the year-over-year spreadsheet.
I still can't see the correlation here. There's still a big difference between the two. But perhaps I'll talk to you later on about that, or to finance, but I can't see. The numbers should line up as far as I can see.
Could it be a difference in the date of the VADM report versus maybe the stage at which the report was compiled, or?
I cannot answer
No.
that.
Okay,
The VADM report is dated 15th of January,
okay, thank you.
and I have more.
Okay. I don't have any, I'll go to Director Nicholson and Smith, and then we'll come back to you, Director Wells.
Thank you. I am interested in the sport tourism situation because,
My colleague John rises to the occasion here.
so I understood, being part of that committee, that we had decided on a larger, going after larger events once every 4 years or something. So are we putting money aside for that 1 4 year period when the budget will be a little bit higher?
Mr. Elzinga?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So within that function, staff have recognized that the operating reserve needs to be addressing both general economic development initiatives as well as the sport tourism. So I believe in the report there's 2 separate numbers relating to that operating reserve. So that is the number that would be available in 4 to 6 years' time. I think it's going to be closer to 6 than 4. We have found with volunteer burnout in our community that we're really going after multi-sport games every 6 years. That funding would be available through the operating reserve.
And so there will be enough. So I don't understand what this 14,000 carried over to the 2019 budget. What is that about?
So, Mr. Chair, if I may just give a little bit of background on the Sport Tourism Initiative, because coming out of the 2005 BC Senior Games, 2008 North American Indigenous Games, the board created a committee to address where we wanted to go with sport tourism, and in a report in the summer of 2014, the board put $55,000 aside for sport tourism initiatives like this. They subsequently added $30,000 for grants to individual sport organizations to assist them. So the direction that we as staff have from the board is that the community will go after single sport, national, international events, whereas staff will go after multi-sport events that are beyond the capability of single sport organizations. So therefore, Director Nicholson is talking about 2 separate things. So for bids for multi-sport games that staff will be organizing in the future every 6 years or so, there is operating for that. The other subsequent was $30,000 within that budget for grants. There's a $30,000 line item for single sport organizations. We created a separate select committee last year to advise the board on grant applications. Of that $30,000 last year, only $15,550 was spent, leaving a remainder in the 2018 budget for those grants of $14,000, and that committee recommended that that amount for grants be transferred to next year's budget. So therefore, for single sport applications, we're anticipating $44,000. The operating reserve would address a multi-sport games in the future.
Thank you. I'll give you another follow-up, and then we'll continue the speakers list.
So my understanding was that we were going to do 2 intakes a year.
Correct.
For the
Grant.
community-led things, and it would be, we would target $15,000 for each of those 2 intakes. So what this is essentially doing is taking surplus and adding it to 2019 so that we could do more community things.
Exactly correct.
And so I am not in support of that. I think
Okay.
that we've got adequate funding to do what we're trying to do, and we should see how we're doing before we put more money into it. So I would prefer it to go into general operating reserves, or else decrease the rec.
Thank you. So that when we get to the resolutions, that's the 3rd resolution, so maybe when we get to the resolutions, we'll discuss these individually, and that'll allow us to make that decision at the time. So I'll go back to my speakers list. I've got Director Smith, Morrison, Acton, Kuhn, and then Wilson, hopefully to close. Director Smith.
Through the chair, I may not have this correct now that you've just brought up that we're going to go through everything individually, but I would, looking at the additional funds of $14,550 for the sports tourism grant program, I see that there's a supplement for cycling website and maps. And one of the things I think that we're really missing here is that is such an important area in health and our area that we should be looking at not just sports tourism, but we should be looking at cycling tourism. And as an avid tour cyclist who cycles all over the world, I know what people are looking for, and we are lacking here because I encourage them to come here and they say, well, how do we know? So that I'm maybe not speaking in turn right now, but I do feel that sports tourism includes cycling.
Thank you. So I think it might be just a conversation around the definition. Sport tourism is sports events that attract like spectator type events, but I think that there is definitely a connection there if we can put that through to staff for comment.
Mr. Chair, through to Director Smith, we're trying to have a very somewhat narrow focus with sport tourism with the budget dollars available. So the direction that I have is a multi-sport games that will be supported every 6 years, that we will have grants for single sport organizations. And other than that, we are a facilitator in general. So we have approximately 30 web pages on our website that outline facilities in the community, sport organizations, contact lists, all of that, but we're not targeting single sport initiatives in general within the narrow focus that I'm dealing with. However, when it becomes a greater economic development opportunity, like the cycling, Amy has included that in her section of the budget. Okay, so that is something that she is addressing.
Yeah, so I would give it over to Ms. Melmock just to comment on the plans that you have in that area.
Sure, and again, bear with me because it's the cycling thing is an interesting road to go down if I can address it that way. In fact, one of the sport tourism grants to communities actually did go to a cycling organization this year, and that was to support an initiative out in Lake Cowichan where they were bringing a sport competition for cycling into the community and promoting cycling in the community. So there have been individual grants through the program that actually support cycling. Our area in terms of cycling really looks at how we can use the notion of cycling as an economic development pivot. And that's particularly important in some of our areas where there's been tremendous focus on that. I know Ladysmith is very interested in that, and so is Lake Cowichan. But to answer your question directly, that supplemental, we've actually taken it out of the budget for now because we feel we can work effectively with Tourism Cowichan Society and with other partners in the community to fund that and take it off the list of expenditures for the CVRD. We think that is more appropriate. We think that we can help to facilitate the conversation and bring resources to it because our Trails Department and Economic Development has a lot of information about cycling, but we feel that actual brochures and websites and whatnot should live within the purview of the tourism.
So just for clarity, the intention would be to deliver that product, but through the existing funding envelope that's available.
Exactly.
So we hope to see that as part of the work plan for EDC and Tourism Cowichan for 2019?
I hope so, and I also hope that we can bring some other resources to bear there too, potentially from other sources, provincial sources or health sources. So thank you.
Thank you. Does that satisfy the curiosity for now? And I
just
think
want lots of cycling.
Ms. Melmock,
So do we.
I think you have allies here that
Yes.
recognize that not necessarily the competitive side, but actually the function of being on a bike as a tourist, especially
Absolutely.
with that connection now that we're driving through the entire island all the way from Victoria is a huge asset. So
Mm-hmm.
I think there's good value in that, and I think you'd find a lot of allies around the table to continue to support and push on that. So I will just, if that's okay from the director, I will resume the speakers list and we'll get through this one. So next to Director Morrison, then I have Acton, Kuhn, Wilson, and Yanni DiNardo.
So, Mr. Chair, just so that I'm on track, we're discussing all the items, not just
EDC,
core?
yes.
Okay. So I'm really curious about the second item in the supplementals list, the regional accommodation strategy. And I guess where I'm coming from is there's been a very keen and underserved interest in the camping side of accommodation inventories and the like since before I was elected. And so I'm looking at the item on our or in our package, and I'm thinking that this is a little light if we're going to be doing justice to not only the built infrastructure but the camping inventory that we don't really have a good grasp on, at least from my perspective. We still have the RVs and the people driving around Cowichan Lake on Thursdays before long weekend looking for a place to pull in and camp. So are you satisfied that the number that you've got in here will give us a fulsome report that will help us to coordinate those inventories better?
To be honest, I would love to see the budget for it increase a little bit. If the board sees it as a priority, and the notion is that we would match any funding that we receive around this table with funding from Island Coastal, and I have discussed this with Lean Robert, so she is on side for this type of strategy because it is of importance and of a regional nature. I would say that adding a few extra resources to that fund certainly would increase the actual efficacy of the study and the areas that we can go into.
Thank you, Ms.
And I think
Malmocken.
Ross would like to speak
Mr.
to
Blackwell.
that. Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Director Morrison. If there's an appetite on part of the board to look at that issue, and in my experience thus far, camping in the region is a big issue. It has implications with respect to impacts on riparian habitat and so forth, so it is a big issue. It's a separate issue to the one we're speaking of now. It's a different kind of accommodation, and I would strongly suggest that it be looked at as a separate standalone study. This study is a tricky enough one around hotel accommodations, and the consulting groups that look after this are specific. Those experts are specific to hotels. They would have to create a larger team that would include other professionals that they would bring to that work. So you may start to lose efficiencies. So for those reasons, I would recommend that if there is an appetite to separate them out.
Follow up, Director Morrison?
Yeah, thank you. And I get that, and knowing that that was included in the supplemental, I'd be more than happy to consider as a staff coming back and giving us an idea as to what that would look like. I think that the dollars that are allocated for the regional accommodation strategy for just the built infrastructure, the B&Bs and the likes, that looks appropriate. And if we were to take camping out and look at it as a separate item, I think that makes a lot of sense.
All right.
So thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, I'll resume our questions list. Director Acton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Certainly, this is something that would be quite interesting to know, and we could use it, but and there's a lot of priorities here, and we're looking at 12% tax increase probably for this year. So I'm finding I want to support it, but I did have a question around the scope, and it sounds like that has been answered a little bit. And I'm also wondering if function 1, 2, 3 would have most of this information that we're looking for anyway, because they had done the hotel tax study. So
I think Tourism Cowichan Society would definitely be a great advisor in this study in terms of looking at the inventory of rooms that we have in the region. That basic information, we would definitely be going back to Tourism Cowichan Society and say, let's compare notes on inventories. And I think it's important to begin posting that information too, because Mayor Seabreg actually had a inquiry about that information. So I think regardless of the study, we need to bring that information forward more clearly. But the intention of the study is really to look at the market demand for rooms and to be able to take that information for to potential developers and say, look, we've done the efficacy here. We know there's a demand in Shawnigan, or we know that there's a demand in, and we've got the statistics and we've got the information to show that there is a viable business case for building new accommodation in regions. Where are the strategic areas to build them? Because the people who specialize in this kind of work really can drill down into that kind of information very quickly and with great efficacy. So I think the intention is to be able to create new accommodation by having the information at your fingertips that provides the business case for developers.
Thank you. Yep, Director Acton.
I just would have a comment, or it kind of ends with a question, but then I guess my question is, we have a lot of really important issues here for this budget term. Is this something that we could wait another year on?
So I'll take that as a rhetorical question. So just for some clarity and just confirmation from staff, this would be, the tourism side should absolutely handle how to get people to the hotel options that we have. But this is more about identifying the shortfalls that we have.
Absolutely.
So for example, we have anecdotal evidence, the New Oyster Bay Hotel north of Ladysmith, they wildly exceeded their expectations for occupancy. So when we go to a hotelier and say there's a beautiful location on Ladysmith's waterfront, they say, well, that's not the anecdotal evidence that you have isn't sufficient for us to justify the investment.
That's
so
right.
They're looking for more the economic picture of the viability of a new hotel within the region and where they would be best located. So that's what that study would be to approve. And just to comment on the point about delaying these kinds of investments, these are the investments that one hotel within itself in the region would more than pay for that from a tax revenue perspective, from an MRDT perspective, instantly. So this is a modest investment in something that could actually have a great gain, not only to the broader local economy, but just in terms of tax revenue potential within the region that could help trickle through and justify that investment. And again, going back to the leveraging piece and some of the work that we've done throughout the region on economic development, it's often cited as sort of a priority to be done, but again, all the information we have right at this point would be anecdotal.
That's right. And thank you for so eloquently presenting that, because I believe that this study actually underpins a lot of movement that we want to make in a number of sectors. Tourism, Cowichan Society knows that we have a pent-up demand for new accommodations in our region, and that we certainly hear it at the visitor centers. The wine sector, the beverage sector here knows that we need more accommodation to support their efforts to invest in new facilities. Certainly John would speak with great eloquence about the need for new accommodations to attract sport tourism. And certainly within the tech sector as well, we're looking to attract new business here and whatnot. Oftentimes if people are coming in and they're bringing people in temporarily, they want to know where they can put them. And it's of vital importance to our film sector as well.
Thank you.
Which used up a lot of those rooms in Ladysmith and Oyster Bay.
Yeah, it was
Sure.
a mini Hollywood for several days there. Thank you for that. I'll go to Director Kuhn, then Director Wilson, and then Director Yanni DiNardo. And I was going to say to close, but now we've added two more, Director Sebring and then Director Smith. Director Kuhn.
I have two questions. The first one is, if all the requests put forward in this budget cycle were approved by the board, how much of an increase in taxes would that generate? Do finance staff have made that calculation, or I think it would probably be relatively easy to do, and I just would like to get a picture as to where do we sit with all these requests and how much increase would we be facing?
Thank you. So I think that would be a different number for every municipality and electoral area, depending on what functions we participate in, but I'm wondering if finance staff can at least give us some idea or some perspective.
So an update on the total requisition increase, not including today's decisions or the last two Recreation Commission meetings, because we've been meeting every night this week. We're currently at a 5.79% increase, and the update has been posted on the website.
Thank you. So that would be an overall budget number,
Overall, and it will, of course, as you say,
be
vary
impacted
from
directly
each
by the
area.
participation in certain functions.
So that wouldn't increase the, let's say, the two new functions, the request for the funding for this?
That does not include the two new functions.
Because those are being discussed today.
Okay, my second question is on the supplemental item for the special coordinator position. Something caught my eye. I looked at the description, and it says in there that, and this goes back to 2018, and it says that with projects such as development of industrial land use, the Ladysmith Economic Development Strategy, don't the munis have their own development strategy and they pay for their own costs? Or, I mean, we...
No, I can answer that and maybe you can comment.
Sure.
The municipalities actually all opted in on the economic development function going back 6 or 7 years. So economic development within the Cowichan Valley is a fully regional function. Municipalities themselves don't have the economic development function. We opted into the CVRD, and that's why, for example, Ladysmith and Shawnigan Lake, we pay by assessment. So North Cowichan, Ladysmith, and then Shawnigan Lake behind that are the three largest contributors to the function in terms of finance cost. It's assessment-based, fully regional.
Okay,
Thank you. Okay, back to my list. I have Director Wilson, and then Yanni DiNardo, Sebring, and Smith to close. And then we can get to the resolutions and we'll go through each one individually. And then we'll have a break. So if there's any motivation there, we'll hopefully keep it concise. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's an item on the VADIM for contract for services, $99,000. Can you tell me what services are provided under that contract?
So what that brings to bear is the airport study is included in there at a rate of $30,000. There is as well, if we were to proceed with the accommodations strategy, it would be within that budget as well. And so what that budget includes is any fee that is related to a consulting activity. And there's also budget funding in there as well for a project that we're managing as a result of the Ladysmith Economic Development Strategy that we did. We have some resources for developing investment tools for the Ladysmith and area. And so within that, that's all of the spending is reflected in there as well.
Thank you. Very quick follow-up. That explains it. Thank you very much. I'm looking for a little bit direction here. I have a resolution that I would like to move, so if you could let me know when the right time is for that, I'd like to put that forward, please.
Yeah, we'll go through the rest of the speakers list and then we'll go through the resolutions and I'll give you that opportunity to put your resolution forward. Thank you. So Director Yanni DiNardo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you to Ms. Melmock. I wondered about as well as Director Morrison's comment on camping, which I think there is a need for. What we've been seeing at UBCM and the study workshops that I've been going to there, and one of them was the Airbnb. Where does this fit into the accommodation study, or does it at all? Because that is a huge component that I'm hearing from everyone. And I just wondered if that is a separate one that we would go with the camping, or if there's some way of evaluating that.
Can I ask you, Director Yanni DiNardo, is that concern coming forth from a policy point of view in terms of how we effectively monitor and tax Airbnbs, or is it?
I think it's all of the above. I
Right.
think this is a whole new business that we are actually just going, it's over here, and we don't want to, we haven't really dealt with it, but we've been saying it for years. It's kind of been in the background, but it is, it's very large business, what I'm seeing with the workshops that we've been attending at UBCM. So are we dealing with this, or are we looking at it, or we're just going to hotels? And because even if I'm campaigning, canvassing, Airbnb, all of that is really big.
So, Ms.
I'm
Melmock,
assuming.
if I can interject, because I would echo Director Yanni Denardo's
Yes.
comments. So there's two pieces there. One is, from the industry, they say this impacts our industry and the viability of new hotel inventory because it pulls away from it. And then on the housing side, and I think Mr. Blackwell wants to comment possibly from a planning perspective, there's the regulation, enforcement, licensing, and so forth. So if you have a conversation with Tofino, for example, this is, you know, an ever-present issue where they've actually gone through a
Absolutely.
regulatory process
Yes.
to limit this.
Yeah.
And as a neighbor, I see it in my neighborhood, and we see it in our neighborhoods everywhere, where those secondary dwellings or suites that are meant to be long-term rentals end up being short-term rentals. So I think that from your perspective, it's more about, are we going to be addressing the competition that it creates for the hotel viability? And then I guess we can go to Mr. Blackwell from the policy planning standpoint around enforcement and regulation.
I'm not going to do anything other than agree with your statement at this point, because I think within the accommodation sphere, it has to be looked at into as just exactly as you've explained, whether it's a competition or in fact whether the volume of Airbnbs are actually just filling a gap right now that could be closed somewhat by having new built accommodation. And then, yes, on the
So-
policy side, there's work to be done there.
So you would be looking at that through the accommodation study, though?
I don't think we'd be looking at the policy side. I'm going to
No, I'm just
defer
saying
to-
about the competition side.
Yes, I
how
would,
does that
I
affect-
would imagine that that in terms of market demand, that they would take into consideration the volume of Airbnbs that are in the region.
Yeah, so when you're judging those proposals that may come from a consultant,
That's
important to
right.
see if they address Airbnb as
Yeah.
a competitive matrix, right?
Exactly.
Through to Mr. Blackwell on the policy piece.
However, that's not really the focus of this study. This is specific to building effectively a business case that can be marketed to investors. So that economic development staff can go to investment companies that are associated with hotels and provide them with this information to see if we can work with them to fill the gap. Airbnbs is a separate issue. It's a significant issue that's not on our radar. This is not.
Did you lose your microphone? We're going to get a crowded podium. Do you need some bleachers maybe, or?
Sure.
So
I
we'll
love it
ask
when
you to
people
repeat
join
every
me here.
word
That's-
verbatim that you just said, Mr. Blackwell, for the pleasure of our audience.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just saying that I agree. Just kidding. What I was suggesting is that the issue of Airbnbs is significant. It's not the purpose of this study that is being referred to here. This is about developing a business case, and that can be shopped with hoteliers and investment companies that build hotels in order to attract them here to fill the gap that currently exists. The anecdotal evidence doesn't work in terms of business attraction. This might go a long way. The same approach was used up in Campbell River, and it resulted in the Comfort Inn. So I would hope that the same would apply here. The Airbnb issue, although significant, is not on the work plan as an issue. It might be something that could be deliberated through strategic planning in relation to other priorities. The final piece that's a little unrelated and peripheral is that the tools available to manage Airbnbs is different in a regional district than it is in a municipality. So that adds another layer of complexity.
I was going to say that would be an electoral area discussion, likely to look at the regulatory side, because obviously the municipalities have different powers and different perspective from that.
Yes.
But I would contend, if you will, that a strong Airbnb market would help justify that more accommodations are needed within the region, and the combination of this study, for example, that would justify new hotel investment, could then turn around with the electoral areas, and then our municipalities could say, okay, now that we've got the accommodation available that people demand, we can focus on maybe stemming the tide of the Airbnb and help on the affordable housing side as well. So it's a multifaceted issue, but this is in context of the economic development piece for the purpose of this discussion right now. Thank you, Mr. Blackwell. Director Yanni DiNardo, is that satisfactory for now? Thank you. I'll go to Director Sebring, Director Smith to close, and then I'll go to Director Wilson for his resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just on this regional accommodation study, $15,000 is not a lot of money, and I get that. And we just heard from Mr. Blackwell that anecdotal information doesn't work. But part of me says, you know what, if I'm the hotel sector, why should I wait for government to do a study that figures out there's demand? If I'm the hotel sector and I'm in competition with others, why don't I cast my eye to the Cowichan Valley and say, you know what, there's a shortage of accommodation here and I'm going to build a hotel. Why does government have to spend money on providing them with that information? Shouldn't it be incumbent on them to ferret that out themselves as the private sector? I struggle a little bit with that. I get that the $15,000 is probably a good investment because we'll get it back through the accommodation tax and all the other stuff if it generates the construction of a hotel. But I just want to back up 3 steps and say, why should it be incumbent on us to do that? Why doesn't the private sector do that themselves?
I would, did you want to say stick to your knitting, or?
No, I don't.
I think that's implied, but if I can respond to the director, I would say that Mayor Adams would give a good perspective on that, on the success that they had in Campbell River with attracting the Comfort Inn and having that there. Everything, and not to undermine the value of economic development, but everything that is done with economic development, we could say, is completely optional. However, you can look at the successes when local government takes the lead. And in places where, and I would give the same recommendation to our municipal councils, whenever we can make an investment that would generate revenue for the region, I think those are wise investments to make if we're looking at something that could grow revenue. And I know that in this case there would be some matching funding there. Do you know what I think you said it would be about $30,000 budgeted for the study work?
Yes, $30,000 for the overall study, and we would expect that hopefully we could make a successful
dollar for
application to the province for
Thank you.
leveraging at 50%, yes.
Thank you. So good comments, Director Sebring. I'll go to Director Smith and then hopefully Director Wilson's resolution.
I need to pass. Both Yanni DiNardo and Stone have covered my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a whole session in itself, just Airbnb, with all of staff. Through to Director Wilson for your resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that all items on the supplementary budget be deferred for the forthcoming strategic planning sessions.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, so we would need that in writing, but I'll go to Mr. Barry.
Mr. Chair, we're going to deal with these one in an order.
Yeah.
So the supplementals come next.
Yeah. So we can accomplish that by discussing each supplemental. I would say that keep in mind that if these aren't approved as part of the budget, the strategic planning may complete and we may want to move forward with them, but if we haven't budgeted for them, then we'd have to be amending budgets throughout the year. But I'll go to the resolutions and we'll go through them one by one. We've discussed them quite well, so hopefully as we get to them, we can keep focused and get to a break here. So number 1's been moved by Director Morrison, seconded by Director Nicholson. Discussion on number 1.
Just a point of process,
Yes.
Mr. Chair. Function 121 in point number 1 does not include the supplementaries because the way I kind of read the recommendation.
Good point. And I would actually say that if we did want to have some discussion on number 4, should we leave number 1 until the end?
That's kind of where I was
I'm looking
going.
to Mr. Barry for feedback on that, because I think, for example, and I'm not putting any motions on the floor here, if under number 4, the pleasure of the committee was to not forward that and reduce the requisition by the $14,500, we'd want to do that before approving the budget as amended. Am I correct in that?
That was my thinking.
Thank you. Thank you. I meant to catch that. I even wrote a note to myself, but I can always count on you for being sharp on the finances. So, Mr. Barry, I believe we did get it moved and seconded, though. Can we table that motion till after?
Absolutely.
Okay. So we need a motion to
So
table?
motion to table that one.
Moved by Director Sebring, seconded by Director Staples. All those in favor? Opposed? None opposed. So we'll go through to the supplementals.
So number 4.
We'll go with number 4 because that'll be the one that's directly
So number
related to
4
the
reads
requisition.
that as a recommendation, that $14,550 in allocated funds for the 2018 Sport Tourism Grant Program be carried over to the 2019 Sport Tourism Grant Program.
Okay, sorry, you want to move that forward? Okay, I was just looking to Director Nicholson because I felt that she had a good comment, just to, if I may. I don't want to interfere in everybody's democratic right here. But Director Nicholson, you made a comment during our discussion of possibly not adding that to the 30,000, but maintaining the $30,000 level and using that 14,550. Would your I got the perspective was maybe keep it at 30,000 instead of raising it to 44,550 and using that 14,550 as part of it. So we would essentially reduce the requisition, decrease the requisition by the 14,550. Was that what you were?
Well, we could decrease the requisition, or we could put it into operating reserve.
Okay, so Mr. Elzinga, I think you've got some input on that.
So, Mr. Chair, if I may, this is a perfect example of how the operating reserve fund policy works, that for that section of the economic development budget that deals with sport tourism, we are close to the 4-month level, and so adding to the operating reserve would have excess funds for operating reserves. So I personally wouldn't recommend that. Practically speaking, we have enough in operating reserve to address any bids in the future. So if the desire of the committee is to go to $30,000 for grants, I would recommend reducing requisition.
Okay, so then I'd like to move that.
Okay, so Mr. Barry, I know you like to have your resolutions written, but can that be taken as?
Mr. Chair, it's really, as long as finance is in support.
Clear. So the 14, we'd remain, the budget would be 30,000 for the grants, and we would reduce requisition for that by 14,550. And that's been moved by Director Nicholson, so it's seconded by Director Yanni DiNardo. Any further discussion on that?
So if I may.
Go to Director Sebring and then Director Morrison.
So the effect of this is that point 4 in the recommendation is not going to happen.
Yeah.
So why don't we just vote on point 4 and vote it down?
Because otherwise the budget has already been proposed with that 14,550 in there, so I think.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. So it has been moved and seconded. I'll go to Director Morrison before I call the question.
Thank you. Through the staff, I guess the issue around the fact that we're looking at a reduction in requisition when we've got a proposed even, and I'm not suggesting I would recommend approval of all of the supplemental items, but we've got a reduced requisition to start with. And I would like there to be still the flexibility if we were to separate out a camping inventory study or the likes. Are we putting at risk, or are you suggesting that there's sufficient funds in operating should we decide to reallocate out of operating to do a separate study?
The economic development portion of the operating reserve is still quite healthy with the asks that we placed on it. I believe that it is sitting at 114 right now, and with the ask that we've asked on the air transport study, it would reduce it to 88,000. But there's actually quite. That's an estimate of where our operating reserve will be this year. There are some unexpended funds that I think will add to that reserve in this fiscal. So I think there would be leverage to work with the EDC operating reserve to advance that camping study, if it is the will of the board.
Thank you. So it's been moved and seconded. I don't see any further hands. I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Director Marsh opposed. The resolution is passed. All right, so Mr. Barry. Go to number 2, I believe.
Yes, Mr. Chair, you'd like to deal with the supplementals?
Oh, actually, let's go to number 1 because this is then the supplementals are in addition to that. Thank you. So we'll go back to number 1. Mr. Barry.
So a motion to remove from the table.
Thank you. Seconded by Director Sebring, moved by Director Morrison. All those in favor? Opposed? None opposed. We're back on to number 1.
And number 1 has been moved and seconded.
Now, would it be approved as amended based on the addition of that resolution number 4? So the resolution doesn't need to change for number 1. It just reflects the change that we just made in number 4.
Yep.
Thank you. Further discussion on number 1. Director Kuhn. Sorry, Director Sebring, did I see?
I was under the impression we were going to go through the items.
The
separately.
supplementals are an addition, so those are a separate conversation. It doesn't impact number 1. The only one that impacted number 1 was number 4. I'm seeing no more hands. I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Unopposed, motion carries. Mr. Barry, number 2.
Okay, number 2, the recommendation is that the supplementary request for $44,000 Special Projects Coordinator position extension be approved.
Thank you. Moved by Director Marsh, seconded by Director Sebring. Discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed? Directors Kuhn, Wilson, and Smith opposed sorry, go back to the, no, you're not Director Marcotte. Director Ryan. Thank you. Sorry, Director Ryan. I just had a gap there. I had written down your name on the front page. So those 4 opposed, the motion passes. Moving on to number 3.
And number 3, the recommendation is that the supplementary request for $15,000 for a regional accommodation study be approved.
Moved by Director Marsh, seconded by Director Marcotte. Discussion. Director Acton.
That was, is it possible for that to come out of operating reserve as well?
I could direct that to staff, but just as a comment, the Director Melmock said after your existing planned expenditures, you expect it to be in the 88,000 range. And if we do the 2 to 4 month based on the budget here, that would be in the healthy range, but I would put that through to staff for comment. Because it looks like the operating budget, based on the policy we have, would be right in the middle of the 2 to 4 month range.
I'm
Or
going
even
to
at the
defer to finance on that question, actually.
So if
Yeah, you're correct. It's right in the 2-month range.
2 month range, and our policy is 2 to 4 months, so I would contend that depleting that by another 15,000 wouldn't fall within our policy, but that is the pleasure of the committee.
Can I comment?
Yeah, you can propose amendment, and if you get it seconded, we can.
I'd like to propose that it comes out of operating reserve. This function is not responsible for a lot of moving parts that could get broken. And so for this year, having just that small buffer, I'd like to see that happen, come out of operating reserve.
So, thank you. It's a clean resolution just to take that from operating reserve. Mr. Barry, do you need it written? Okay, thank you. It's been moved. Do I have a seconder? Director Sebring. So I'll comment quickly and then go to a speakers list. I've got Director Morrison. Just keep in mind that it may not have a lot of moving parts, but grant programs are announced every day, and you would want to have matching funds in that budget when those time comes, especially in a federal election year. There are new granting programs that will be announced specifically in June, I know around FCM, and having money in the economic development budget as potential matching funds can be very valuable when you're trying to be on the fly. But I'll go to Director Morrison and then Director Marsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I concur with what you said, and I just want to bring everybody's attention to the fact that our numbers going down, and it's really challenging in upcoming years to have flashy and peaks and mountains in the requisition. And I think that we've got a reasonable number in our operating reserve. We've already identified there might be a couple of other opportunities, and if we reduce requisition significantly in this year, and normal course of business happens in next year, we may be seeing a fairly significant number coming back. So I'm not in favor of pulling this out of operating reserve. I think we've got a good budget before us, and we've got the potential for other activities that we may deem to be important later on in the year that we should be prepared for. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Marsh.
Yes, I have nothing to add to what Director Morrison said, but I entirely agree.
Thank you. Seeing no further hands, I will call the question on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment? Opposed? So do we need to record these?
No.
Thank
So
you.
the amending motion is defeated.
Thank you. So we'll go back to the original motion, which is the supplementary request for 15,000 for a regional accommodation study be approved. Any further discussion? Further discussion? I wasn't sure if those were hands for discussion. I don't see any further discussion. I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Smith, Sebring, opposed. The resolution passes. Thank you. So just before we take a quick break, I just want to say to the committee that this has been a great start. I really appreciate the discussion and the perspective. We've got a long way to go today, so get a good stretch. Mr. Barry, what would you recommend we come back in 10 minutes?
10 or 15, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so let's say 15 minutes, but I really do ask the directors, can we be seated at 22 just so that we can get back down to it and take the 13 minutes or so, and we'll see you then? Thank you. Well, I tried to do some tunes with it, but unfortunately, it doesn't allow me to press it that fast. So do we have quorum, Mr. Barry?
We have quorum.
Okay, I'm going to, pardon me? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, we will still have quorum if Director Staples has to be excused. So before we get your declaration, we are on R9?
R8.
Yes. R8, sorry, my apologies. My notes ran into R8, so. Maybe we can get our agendas for the chair double-spaced for the future. All right, so we are on R8. I'll go to Director Staples.
Okay, so I'm going to be leaving for R8 and R9. I'll just do them both now, so I don't have to come back in and leave again.
Thank you.
We're just, the organization I work for has had a short-term project with the Housing Association that's not quite ended yet, so
Thank you.
I have to
All
declare.
right. We'll get you out of the hallway before we move to R10. Almost forgot you last time. Thank you, Director Staples. All right, so we will continue on. Mr. Barry.
R8, the Cowichan Housing Association, this is their proposed work plan and budget.
Thank you, Mr. Kieber. Have you got an introduction for us, or is this just for questions from the board or from the committee?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm really just here to say the report here is to present the work plan as well as the proposed budget by the prepared by the association. Mr. Chris Hall is here. He's the chair of the Cowichan Housing Association board. So if he has any detailed questions about the work plan, he'll be able to answer that. Just remembering that this is a grant function where we simply contribute funding, so it's very little staffing. We'll be working on this budget.
Thank you. So I'll take questions from the committee for either Mr. Kieber in Finance or for Cowichan Housing Society. And I want to thank the Society for the work into the work plan and leading up into this point. It's been excellent work, not only in this plan, but in the years preceding that really put some good information into our hands in terms of the decisions we need to make. So I'll go to questions from the directors. This is only for information, so this is a good opportunity if you'd like some perspective. But I'm not seeing any hands. Director Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm seeing on the on R8 the $108,000 for the cost of the referendum, and yet two staff reports that I've seen, and I've got copies of them here from 2018, excuse me, April and June of last year, estimated the cost at $40,000. I'm wondering why there's been such a huge increase in the cost of the referendums, almost triple from the $40,000 originally.
Thank you. Through to staff. So I think that it showed originally 40,000 and then the cost of the referendum was more than that. Yeah.
So,
Mr. Keeper.
I'll attempt. So the 40,000 that we were talking to was specific, I think it's to Mr. Barry's report, referring to do with the direct referendum costs. I believe there was referendum costs as well as publications that were done. There's open houses that were done. In addition to that, the referendum costs that for the actual day, what I mean by that is, so all the elections stations had, was the costs there were split and shared with both referendum questions as well as the election itself. So the in some situations where there was acclamations or there still were referendums taking place. So those full costs were associated to referendum costs. So those were some. The other thing is some of the costs that, and I don't, finance will have the detailed questions of what actual money was spent on, but the other thing was staff time. So there was a staff member working on this situated in electoral area services. So 100% of the costs of that person, when wages and benefits, when they were working on this, were also included in the 108,000. And I believe that was the largest item. Sorry, no, I'm thinking not.
Through. Sorry, just if we can let finance finish and then we'll come back to follow up.
I was just going to say, Mr. Keeper is is exactly correct. The costs do include a whole variety of things, including the cost of the actual day, as well as all of the publications and the fees paid for the consultant to produce the materials that were shared with the public, which are the majority of the costs of the.
Thank you. So just two pieces, and just for your information, Director Wilson, too, that was a direction of the board at the time to do a deeper engagement on the issue leading up to the referendum. So there was significantly more costs around the engagement piece. And then there was also, as Mr. Keeper said, properly allocating the staff resource costs to the referendum rather than it being pulled from the electoral area services.
And if I can just add one more comment, there were numerous reports done to do with these projects going forward. And I believe at least one or two of them talked about potential costs being as high as 100,000. So it was expected to be somewhere in that range. So different reports were done by different people. So I'm not, we can find those other reports too if you like them.
Follow up, Director Wilson.
Yeah, it's not, I'm not sure if I heard that correctly. You were saying that the 108,000 included the cost of both the referendums. That's not true because there's another 102,000 for the water study as well. So it's close to $250,000 which was spent on those two referendums. And I can only go on the information that I've had in the past. And I still can't reconcile the huge increase in there. But I mean, for instance, if
Sorry, I think that there might be clarity that we need to provide just on that piece around the 108 and 102.
So pardon me if you misunderstood, but, or I didn't explain it correctly, but the 108 included the housing share of the referendum, of all the referendum costs. The water, those costs were specifically identified and allocated to that. So you're correct. It's over 200,000 for both of them. Absolutely. And which is one of the reasons why we, or this board, chose not to do any other referendum questions that were also debated at the time.
And just for perspective, just from somebody at the table, there was a deep discussion specifically around housing about doing an AAP versus a referendum because of those dramatically increased costs for a referendum. But as we went through the process, even though the original proposition was to do an AAP with a deep engagement around the housing issue, the demand seemed to be from the communities to put it to referendum, and so forth. The board did make the decision to support that. But you are correct; it's a significant sum, and it highlights some of the challenges around referendum. Just before I go back, I think Mr. Barry has a comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to add for Director Wilson as well, and for the other directors, when you see a number from Legislative Services, that's the actual physical running of the referendum. That does not include any community engagement whatsoever. So this is booking the halls, the ballots, the staff costs, et cetera, everything just for the referendum. And in the past, we have certainly noticed, I'm thinking the regional parkland acquisition way back, you have the cost of the referendum and then the community engagement, which is much, much more.
Thank you. Follow up.
So if I'm hearing this correctly, then the 108,000 is an incorrect figure as well. There's still more to add to that? For instance, I mean, I'm reading this report here, and it says staff resources would be used to update and manage PlaceSpeak social media and the regional district's website. There's a staff resources there which says it's included. And now we're hearing that staff resources were allocated to these referendums. I honestly don't understand why this is escalated to an extent that it's triple almost the original cost. Now, maybe I'm being a bit simplistic or naive. This can't happen. $250,000, and I agree, the referendum was agreed to by, I was part of that movement. But 200,000 plus? It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I don't disagree with the expensive costs. I don't know if staff has any more comment on that process. I know it was raised at the time that the referendums were quite expensive. And like I said early on in the process, in light of that, the committee or the board had originally authorized an AAP for the housing function, but the watershed function to go to referendum. And then as the demand was built up and we were called as a board to put it to referendum, the decision was made, even though those extensive costs would be sufficiently more. But Mr. Carruthers, if you want to maybe hopefully put a bow on that piece.
Yeah, if I can. The board was well aware, the board was made well aware of the potential cost of a referendum. From my experience, Mr. Barry's experience over our careers in conducting referendums, $100,000 is not out of line to conduct a referendum campaign when you combine the cost of the actual referendum and the level of community engagement that goes into it. So this board was made well aware of the potential costs. You're talking about one specific report. There were other reports, and I believe they were probably range from $75,000 to $100,000. It's difficult to actually predict how much that is going to be, given the varying scales of engagement that we went out to. I just want to say that is not out of line with a local government that undertakes a significant referendum campaign like that, and the board was well aware of those potential costs.
I'll give you one more follow-up, but I do have a speakers list, so I may come back to you if there's more after this. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I understand that. I would like, therefore, then, to be pointed in the right direction to see those other reports. I haven't seen those. These are the only ones that I've seen. I'd also like, excuse me, I'd also like to see a breakdown of these $108,000, what was actually spent where. That's all we've got is one number there. It doesn't say where they came through.
And I think that would be appropriately addressed through the staff, through the CAO, and they can get you all of that stuff. But from my recollection, and it was something that was discussed again and again and then again and again, we were cautioned about those expenses. And I just wanted to say, because you did say, Mr. Carruthers, local governments, I know that even in our small municipality, when we've discussed referendum type questions, those costs can be upwards of $50,000 or somewhat less in conjunction with the general election, but in such a broad regional district with so many polling places and all that supporting information, we were cautioned that it was going to be very expensive, but even through that cautioning process, the demands seemed to be from the communities that they wanted it to go to referendum, even in light of that. But again, I believe staff can get those get those reports. Mr. Carruthers.
Yeah, and in relation to that request, Mr. Chair, I would suggest as a committee that I know that individual directors have questions and want more information. I would suggest as a best practice that if the committee is so inclined to want staff to spend money, or sorry, spend effort to provide that information, that it gets passed as a resolution so that we can then track that, and that staff would go, and it is the will of the committee for the staff to undertake that analysis and provide that back to the entire committee rather than to one director.
Thank you. So Director Wilson, if it's good with you, I'll come back to you after the discussion on the item, and then you can ask for that resolution, and that direction could be provided to staff. So I've got Directors Marsh and then Kuhn. Director Marsh.
We're just still asking questions.
Yep. Okay, Director Kuhn.
I don't have questions, I just have two comments. One comment is, Mr. Chairman, you keep answering questions that are directed at staff, and I think staff should answer these questions.
Thank you. Just to comment, the questions are always directed to the chair, and I always ask staff for clarity if I'm incorrect. Thank you.
The other comment I have is, I seem to remember the discussions about the cost of referenda. Now, these two referenda were attached to elections. How much would they have been if they hadn't been attached to elections, if they had been separate? Would have been considerably higher cost then. And I seem to remember when early on when we had discussions about referenda, the advantage to attach a referendum to an election was that it was supposed to be very much cheaper, and I remember too the cost was supposed to be about $40,000 to $50,000, and I remember the question came up, well, if it isn't attached to an election, how much would it be then? And I seem to remember it was between $100,000 and $120,000. So now I'm amazed too. Now we're facing the cost. The same cost that we were quoted would be if it wasn't attached to an election. And yeah, I could imagine that some of the cost was all the publication and all the sessions that were held, but still it is mind-boggling how much money is going just into. That's not even any productivity. That's not. It's just, you know. Anyway, yeah, it's a lot of money.
Thank you. So I'll just remind the committee that we are talking about the budget items for Cowichan Housing Association, and I'll go to Director Sebring.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I would just further to what we heard from Director Wilson. You know, we need to distinguish out the actual cost of the referendum, the polling stations, the cost of running the vote at $40,000, and then $68,000 for the information package that was attached to it. That's kind of my understanding. The $68,000 was, for lack of a better word, the public relations we did to get this thing passed. Maybe that's a bit of oversimplification. I'm a bit surprised that that money is being charged back to the function. I think when folks approved this function, they didn't think they were approving the costs of the public relations campaign that they were that convinced them to vote for it to begin with, that this thing rolls back into that. I was always under the assumption that those things would come out of some general fund, be it legislative services or wherever. But the fact that this is going back into that when folks thought they were paying for housing, not public relations, kind of troubles me a little bit.
Through to Mr. Kieber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm trying to be very clear. Staff are very clear throughout this whole process that all costs for any referendums or any AUPs will always be charged back to any new service, only if it's approved. If it's not approved, then it'll stay in whatever service. What I mean by whatever services, if it's regional, it's general government. If it's not regional, if it's electoral area, even an individual fire department or water service, then there's a function called 250 where it would stay in there. But it's very clear. It's no different than any, we have a regional reserve fund. When the board approves expenditures out of that, if any new function is created from that, they pay that funds back as well.
So it's just supplementary. If the referenda had not passed, we still would have spent the additional $68,000. That would have come out of that other line.
Would have been general government in this
Full
case.
108,000 would have been charged to general government.
Thank you. So I don't believe on this item that we have any more questions, but I'll go to Director Wilson if you wanted to make a motion on sort of providing the background information, so.
Yeah, I have just one more comment, if that's okay. I'm glad that Director Kuhn elaborated on what I was saying here, with the referendum questions being on the same ballot paper as the election for the candidates. So I still am mystified at these costs. Could I ask, in the future, we've been told, we've heard the expression all the time, skin in the game. This was supposed to be seed money to attract more money. Will the Cowichan Housing Association's future reports indicate how much funding they've been able to attract through the funds that we've given them? If I could just get a quick response to that, and then I'll propose the
Mr. Kieber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So that is really a separate issue altogether. That's to do with the service agreement that we have with the Housing Association. If that's, and that's still to come, if that is something that we want, we just need to make sure that that's one of their requirements that we instill in the agreement. Earlier there was a discussion about the tourism Cowichan and their reporting. Once again, that's a process we went through and determined what we needed to see. Once again, if that's what we want for the house from the Housing Association, absolutely we should be asking for that in the agreement.
That's great. Thank you very much. So basically, I would like to make a resolution that the reports that we've spoken about that can take into account these $100,000 costs. I haven't seen those. I'd like to be pointed in the right direction as to where I could get copies of those, and I'd like to see a breakdown of costs from this $108,000 as to what it was actually spent on.
Okay, do you have that in writing? So, Mr. Barry, if you may,
Chair,
if you
I
may
think
assist.
I'll assist here. What I believe Director Wilson's looking for is a detailed breakdown of all referendum and election costs for the 2018 event.
Thank you. So that's been moved by Director Wilson, seconded by Director Sebring. Any discussion on that? Pretty straightforward, I think. Oh, sorry, Director Nicholson, I thought you wanted to speak to the issue, not this resolution, but I'll go to Director Nicholson and then Director Acton on the motion that's on the floor.
Yeah, I think this is a really good idea because we haven't had good figures on referendum versus, what's that other thing called? AAP. And it is an important decision every time we make, and we know we have great pressure from the community to take things to referendum. So I think that having current information about this will be very important, but I would like to add that I would like to see some sort of an analysis of whether how effective we thought our community outreach was, because we really put a lot of extra effort and time into that, and what we might do differently next time, like some sort of an assessment of how we did on those 2 referendum questions, because it was a big initiative, and we should be learning from that.
Thank you. I think that's good advice. I don't know, Mr. Carruthers, do you think we need to amend the resolution to direct staff to bring that, or would that be part of the perspective that maybe staff could provide with the numbers?
There's a little bit more, excuse me, Mr. Chair, a little bit more analysis involved than just simply providing numbers. So I would suggest if that is the will of this committee, that it be done as a resolution for us to do an analysis of the effectiveness of the engagement associated with both.
So Director Nicholson, did you want to move that? So I guess the amendment would be to add, along with an analysis of the effectiveness of the community engagement process leading up to the referendum. That sound suitable, Mr. Barry?
I'm just wondering, Mr. Chair, if you want to
Be
treat them
separate
as 2
resolution.
separate.
Okay, thank
Because
you.
the election breakdown cost is going to be reasonably straightforward.
Okay. So if we have any discussion on the resolution, if not, I'll call the question and then we can move to the next resolution. All those in favor? Opposed? None opposed, motion carries. And then I'll go to Director Nicholson.
I don't have anything written down, but I'm not looking for like an intensive analysis, but I think that we have some community groups that participated in outreach to the community. So I think that if we had maybe just a couple of meetings with those groups and did some sort of a debrief and documented that, there might be some important lessons learned and ideas about how we could do things better and differently next time.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So for that reason, I mean, holding meetings with our stewardship, there's going to be work involved in doing that and inviting them and organizing the meetings and doing the analysis. So, yeah, I think it just furthers the argument that we should have it as a separate item and that the staff be provided or requested to provide an analysis of the effectiveness of the engagement for both referendums in 2018.
Mr. Barry, if I give you a moment, do you think you can craft a resolution that would be suitable? We're getting way off track, but it's important work, so I think that it's...
Certainly, Mr. Chair. Like, we've got the principles here. I'll work on the wording for the minutes.
I thought Mr. Carruthers' wording was good, if we can roll back the tape.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if I can get a mover and a seconder for that. Moved by Director Nicholson, seconded by Director Yanni DiNardo. Any further discussion on that? Director Marsh.
I can see that this would be very valuable information. I'm hoping that we're not expecting this to come back in like 2 months or something. I'm wondering, there's so many things that we have to do, including strategic planning. We've talked about board development. There's a lot going on, and I'm just not sure. I don't think we're about to go to a referendum on anything anytime soon. So I'm not sure that this would be, in my opinion, a high priority for the next couple of months.
Okay, I would defer to staff on allocating the resources, and then maybe when we have a more strategic type discussion, that can be brought up, and staff can sort of give us an idea on the timing.
Yeah.
But
Like, I guess what I'm trying to say, I think this is very valuable. It wouldn't be my top priority to have it delivered any time soon, because there's so many other important things.
thank you. I appreciate.
So it's not that I don't think it's great. I think it's great.
I appreciate the perspective. Do we have any further discussion on this resolution? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in, oh, sorry, Director Smith. Just trying to get us back onto our agenda.
So I just have a question involving all the amount of money that was spent. So one of the staff was moved from the land use area planning to work in this area on this referendum and the Cowichan Housing Association. And it left a blank in our planning department. There's more than just this amount of money that was impacted. We had our development applications went behind because we had a blank area. That's also a cost to us too, and we haven't got that recognized in this situation. So when it gets looked at as a figure, we need to look at what the impact was on the land use area that had a vacant spot left while we moved a staff member into this area.
Okay, thank you for the comment. Director Acton?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with Director Marsh on this. I'm feeling like perhaps our scope's going to get a little too big, and then the opportunity of looking at lessons learned will just take away from other things that need to happen. I think we can have some lessons learned just by a quick email, or I don't even feel like it needs to be a resolution. Our communications person, I'm sure, has analytics on the effectiveness of the outreach. So I'd like to hear from staff about the scope of this, or perhaps we could just bring this back on a slightly later date and get back on track.
Thank you. Again, I'll just go back to, we have the resolution on the floor. We'll take a vote on it and then work with staff on timing, and I'm sure they'll bring back some clarity on when the best time to do that is. All right, so I'll call the question then. All those in favor? Opposed? Directors Acton and Marcotte and, oh, sorry, Director Morrison, Ryan, Acton and Marcotte opposed, I believe. Did I get all of the opposed? No, so the resolution passes. All right, so we'll move back to the agenda item. So we've done the for information on Cowichan Housing. I wonder if it's possible that we move to R9 now, where we actually have the discussion of the budget for the function for this year.
And R9, Mr. Chair, is the draft budget for Function 498, Cowichan Housing Association.
Thank you. So we do have the resolution there, and moved by Director Marsh, seconded by Director Nicholson. Discussion. Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed? Councillor Kuhn and Smith opposed. The motion carries. Thank you for that. Now, I do have some instruction that, based on some of, I believe, the earlier comments during public input period, that it may be more constructive and instructive if we go to R11 before R10. So if that's the pleasure of the committee, I'd like to just change the order of those two. So we'd go to item R11 first, and that's the, Mr. Berry.
Yes, R11 is the 2019 Work Plan, Function 532, for the drinking water and watershed protection. And you have a report from the Manager of Environmental Services, and Mr. Crothers will be speaking to it.
Mr. Crothers. So while they work that out, I just did want to say to the members of Cowichan Housing Association that were here, thank you for coming and being ready to answer questions.
I've got my notes here, and Kate will carry on with the body of the presentation. I'm just going to do a quick introduction, and I don't think that I need to spend a lot of time discussing the background to this particular service. I have a majority of the board members that were on the board at the time, and most of you that are at the table now were heavily involved in the consultation process. This started out as a direction of the board through the strategic plan in 2015 to be exploring, and it initially started with the Cowichan in terms of exploring a potential service to support water stewardship activities and water management in the Cowichan. Our consultation with other agencies, with the public, identified the fact that a regional approach was more appropriate than doing a watershed by watershed approach. That process evolved to the board approving us proceeding with a drinking water and watershed protection service for the entire region. Unlike any other initiative, I think, that's been undertaken in the regional district, this was 2 years in the making. We had an extensive public consultation process where we essentially went out to the community, asked their input on what local government could be doing in terms of coordinating and supporting watershed management, with the final result of that extensive consultation being the service that was proposed. You'll also, recall that some original proposals had come in. The original proposal for this service was just over $2 million, had a fairly extensive scope. When we went back out to the public, and the appetite of the public to support $2.4 million was not there, staff went and reduced the scope of the service. We brought it in at just over $1 million, with a number of items removed. The board settled on a $750,000 maximum annual requisition. So that's what's going to be in front of you today. This is really about a different way of doing business in the regional district. Water is an overarching issue for the entire regional district, and we want to ensure that decisions around water are integrated with decisions around land use planning, around public safety, and that we have an integrated approach to dealing with these issues. So I just wanted to set the context that in addition to establishing this service and getting it underway, we also internally are going to be looking at our organizational alignment to make sure that we're better equipped to integrate the work that comes out of the Drinking Water Protection Service with the other aspects of services that we deliver in the regional district. So a comprehensive report approach. I'm just going to go through these quickly because Kate is going to need the time to go through in more detail. But as I said, the watershed service would provide us with new capacity, great water resource information and land use planning, that we have science-based decision-making, that we have the capacity to go out and gather the data that we actually need in either to support your decision-making at the board level or also to support decision-making by others such as the province in terms of allocation of water resources, water licenses, those sorts of things. And also the importance of partnerships. That's the one thing we heard as we went through the consultation process. Water stewardship, water management is complex. We can't do it alone as a regional district, so this is very much about supporting partnerships. Moving away from a focus on financial structures, our typical structure where we have services in silos and we isolate our work into those silos. This is really about being more effective and integrating our work to meet the board's goals. Leveraging powers of partnership and collaboration, building new capacity within our organization and exploring new ways of doing business. And finally, aligning our corporate strategies. So aligning our organization so that we're able to deliver on the board's objectives, making sure that we have the right programs in place to deliver on those, and that the projects that are within those various programs are harmonized and are effective, really with the ultimate goal of building on each other to achieve the board's objectives. And with that really quick summary, I'm going to turn it over to Kate to get down to the meat and potatoes of this service.
Thank you, Mr. Carruthers. Welcome, Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Brian. And I think I appreciate that. So what you've got before you is just looking internally to the CVRD, the sort of an example of the functions that currently support watershed management within our organization. It's a fairly large grouping, everything from environmental initiatives all the way to corporate services and the 600 series, which is really the water utilities programs itself. So multiple departments, multiple divisions, multiple objectives dealing with watershed and watershed management issues. There are overlaps, there's gaps. We're hoping that over the course of 2019, we'll be able to, as an organization, as Mr. Carruthers has said, really sit down and tease out how best we deliver these services in a consistent way. This doesn't take into consideration our municipal partners who are also part of this new function and who have expectations both within, say, for example, North Cowichan, but also Islands Trust, who would like to see some level of integration within their own communities. So we thought that it would be useful just to take a few minutes to go through the existing programs and services provided under the sort of the larger umbrella of the Environmental Services Division. There are currently 5 functions under that umbrella. There's a staffing level of 3 full-time employees. We've kind of broken it a little bit up for you in terms of sort of the yellow blocks are really driven by regulatory requirements. Or clearly board direction to undertake that work. The green piece is really an indication of areas where there's kind of a focus on water-based activities at the sub-regional and at the regional level through the 131 function. So if we drill down just within that one function on the left-hand side, we'll kind of put the other ones aside for this particular presentation, but if we just look at the 131 function itself, it really has 5 key areas that we focus on: climate change, environmental protection and policy, communication and education, technical support, largely to other components within the organization itself, and then the water studies piece. So under climate change, we're really looking at adaptation and mitigation, a lot of work around risk to the communities from natural hazards, but also risk to our own organization and its assets. So very integrated process there. a very large scope of work as well. Under the environmental protection and policy piece, this is really around environmental planning and how it relates to land use services and the development of land over time. So really looking at identifying ecologically or sensitive areas in order to inform further policy movement. Some of the work that we do around data acquisition, those sorts of things. Communication and education, really framing around kind of the outward-facing piece, but also quite a bit of internal dialogue, both within the organization of CVRD, but also providing support services for municipal partners. Given the kind of the breadth of the activities within the division, there's obviously issues that you only have so much staff, so many resources, so much capacity, so we try to leverage as much as possible and put the information out there. Lastly, the technical support, and over time, this particular component of the 131 function has grown. A lot of the work that we do at this point, because of our own internal resources within the 131 budget, have been eroded over years as we rely largely on grant funding to actually keep the programs going. So grant applications, support to other groups for aligned granting, those sorts of things, as well as technical support, kind of cross-functional discussions with the rest of the organization. The other piece too is the level of referrals, and there's sort of the internal referral process, which is currently being fine-tuned, but also referrals from both the province and the federal government, which are critical to us as well. And then we've got sort of the water studies bundle, which is regional in nature as opposed to the sub-regional work that we do under the South Cowichan program itself. So the grouping of activities that you see here has really grown in time. First, it was the original focus on the Cowichan Basin Water Management Plan and its activities, as well as support as it's grown over time for the Cowichan Watershed Board. So I think that we've accomplished a great deal of foundational work that will help the new function move forward. And I'll just give you a few examples. The floodplain mapping of the Lower Cowichan and Coxsila area, as well as the implementation and development of infrastructure, key infrastructure there. The development and inception of the kind of the watershed board, so the first piece around what should a board look like, getting it going, what are the key foundational studies that would be required by that group, and providing support to that. As well as ongoing studies with regards to water supply in the upper watershed. Mapping and development of a GIS-based watershed atlas that really serves the function across the organization, a major amount of work that went into that over the last few years in terms of developing kind of a key analytic process. Watershed-based risk assessments, and you'll be receiving that report over the next month or two. Tons of water and technical studies on the Cowichan system, as I've alluded to, including drought planning, et cetera. And so there are a few things that will be coming forward for you, including the structured decision model presentation later in February with regards to the Cowichan long-term water storage and potential future federal investments. Regional governance discussions with the First Nations within the region. That was a 2-year process that I think really provided substantial bridge building. The risk-based watershed analysis and some of the communication documents that we're in the process of preparing, and the list goes on. So this is also the bundle where the Cowichan Watershed Board's current funding has been driven from for the last few years. So my recommendations for the Function 131, and you have to consider that the budget report in front of you has been developed sometime in the past prior to the referendum going forward and being passed. So these are kind of updated recommendations. which is to move the water study bundle from the Environmental Services Division of work and refocus the division's current work on climate adaptation and environmental protection, environmental planning. So reinvest the capacity and refocus the group's work on those two key areas. So the recommendations look like this. Move the water resource planning activities under the new drinking water protection function. Move the financial support for the Cowichan Watershed Board to the new function at the current level, pending program definition over 2019. And refocus, realign the Function 131 environmental initiatives on environmental planning and climate change. Recommendations with regards to some of the other functions that you saw on that broader list is to leave all of the other functions as they are, pending work with partners, pending work within the organization, to development of a tabling of a 10-year strategy in early fall of 2019. So that work continues in those particular areas while we grapple with what should stay within a sub-regional approach and what should actually be a regional approach. It will give our partners time to be really part of that conversation as a resilient process. The recommendation that the drinking water program initiated by CVRD, and that is kind of a tactical, not necessarily consultation with partners, but investment, early investment in some of these key areas, which is continuation of the water quality program across the rest of the region. There's limited dollars there. We want to have staff time and technical support in developing a very robust strategy that would come forward as part of the overall 10-year strategy. There's been limited funding set aside for early investment in components of the hydrometric monitoring system. Obviously, a well in a shallow aquifer is much cheaper than a well in a deep rock aquifer, and so there's a nominal amount there, largely for the development of an overarching strategy that would guide investment over time. Continue with the watershed management strategies. We've got quite a bit of work that we are about to present to you with regards to risk. I'm assuming that there will be questions coming forward from this group as well as the community groups within those particular areas. So to not drop that while we wait for the larger strategy, but spend a little bit of time there. Lastly, one of the components that is a struggle for us is having analytic GIS support, so a little bit of money is put aside for that as well. So consultation with partners outside of the CVRD, we've identified, certainly through a lot of the public consultation, through our partnership, is that we can't do this as an organization alone. We need to do it in partnership, aligned, leveraging each other where possible, and so continue with the consultation with external partners. So work with the partners to inform the long-term plan for the board approval. Hire a neutral facilitator. We are an actor in this, and we want to make sure that as we move forward, that the discussion, the strategy is developed that allows us an opportunity to be an active partner, not necessarily wear a duplicating hat of also being the facilitator. Establish an interim technical committee to formally participate in that work plan development. The recommendation is that technical committee sunset when the plan is tabled, and that the committee also tables at the same time recommendations about what that technical advisory committee would look like. The skill set in terms of the program alignment versus oversight is very different. We also recognize that through some of the discussions with the board wanted to have an active oversight, and so we don't want to get too far ahead of the board in terms of their role. So it's a bit of an opportunity there. So next steps. We're hoping that over the next month and a half that the 2019 budget and the work and the framework, I should say, for the development of the long-term work plan is approved. Return to committee with recommendations regarding the establishment of the technical committee and what their interim terms of reference would be. with a recommended list of participants for board approval, and develop and release the RFP for the consultation component of the program, develop the 10-year work plan over the course of 2019. Sorry, so that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, and I'll go to the committee for questions. Mr. Barry, just for framing, we're R11, so that the recommendation on R11, and then I'll go to the committee for questions and input.
Correct. We're on R11, and the first recommendation, when you get to it, will be recommending that the 2019 work plan be approved.
Thank you. So questions from committee. Director Nicholson?
Maybe I missed it. What was this, a consultation program?
Through to staff, so the consultation program for the
So that recommendations through you to the director is really the RFP for the hiring of the neutral facilitator and the development of what that consultation strategy would look like over the course of 2019.
Thank you. Director Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So if I'm understanding this correctly, Kate, we have established services already, such as protection groups or organizations. Now we have this function now, which has been approved by the referendum. So we've got a previous and a future, and now we're in the interim. And in that interim, you're recommending that, for instance, if you go back to that, yeah, for instance, there's a community plan, the Shawnigan Basin, all sorts of things that are in there, that those stay in place until a new plan is formulated?
That's correct. That's my recommendation for 2019, that the existing budgets and existing programs stay in place during the transition period. Yeah.
Okay. And any funding that was given to them before should still be available to them to carry on the work until, I'm sorry to belabor this point, but I want to make sure that work doesn't stop.
That's my recommendation, that the existing programs continue until such time as the process identifies what's appropriate to be under a new regional function, what should be under a sub-regional or a specified area function. It also allows us an opportunity to say what components are critical, what are nice to do's, given our opportunity to fund them. However, the recommendation is a recommendation to the board. It's the prerogative of the board to make decisions with regards to the funding themselves. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So just before we move on to the speakers list, so am I to hear that your recommendation is that the funding for the Cowichan Watershed Board, Shawnigan Basin Society, et cetera, remain in place for 2019? I'm just trying to reflect on our public input period and just get some clarity there, because there seems to be some confusion, and I'll be included in the confused.
Right. So my recommendation, currently the Cowichan Watershed Board's financial contribution comes from the 131 function. I'm recommending that that financial contribution come from the new drinking water function, that correctly aligns it.
Thank you.
The funding, and I'll be pointed here, the funding for the Shawnigan Basin Society is not a function in which that I control. That is up to the prerogative of the board and the director. My recommendation is to continue with that function, to provide the opportunity for development of a larger strategy over the 2019 period.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
But it would not come from the drinking water watershed protection function. It would come from the function that exists within today.
That's correct.
Thank you.
And I'm also making recommendation when we get to that particular budget that the technical advisory committee or the consultation group that we speak with make recommendations about the granting component of that new function. What's appropriate, what would be the criteria, what does that look like, as opposed to, as a staff member, simply looking at a budget and deciding without an opportunity for due consideration and input about what the metrics might be for that particular line item.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll go back into the speakers list. I have Director Acton, then Marsh, and Nicholson. Director Acton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. wanted to mention that yesterday we were at the Cowichan Watershed Board presentation, and I think it was really eye-opening. It was a beautiful model that they have created, and they do some really great work. But my question is, I'm wondering where the province is in all of this, because in a past staff report, it states, a pending workshop with appropriate regulatory agencies regarding local government roles and responsibilities and water management will identify existing gaps in regulatory responsibilities and potential for improved effectiveness. So that meeting happened, and what has come out of that?
Mr. Carruthers.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, we did have a meeting. We had a meeting with all of the applicable agencies, provincial ministries, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, even Municipal Affairs and Housing were in attendance. That was really about looking at what role this service could play in terms of dealing with some of those gaps. So we wanted to get input from the province as to what their current regulatory schemes are, trying to get a sense of what the Water Sustainability Act, what kind of opportunities might come out of that, and how this service could align with or support some of the decisions that are made. Very often the province is making allocation decisions, management decisions without full understanding or full data around the decisions they're making. How could this service locally support some of those decisions? So it wasn't about the province stepping up and providing funding or making changes. It was really about alignment and how could this service help us locally affect future decisions in terms of providing data, providing information to the province. And also what powers could we eventually draw down potentially from the province in terms of localized watershed management.
Thank you. Follow-up?
One more question. And also to be clear on the Shawnigan Basin Society function, the conversation that's going on today, will that be raising their requisition? Because I have recommended that it remain at zero. This function is only paid by Area B, and I'd like to have the opportunity of my rationale behind that then to the board? Or will it come up next week?
So we're through to staff. I think that's through EAS.
Yeah.
So it's not a regional function, so it wouldn't be at this committee, but that would be, those decisions would be made at EAS. Thank you. Okay, I'll go on to Director Marsh and then Director Nicholson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've really become aware in the last year or so, as we're trying to do things more regionally, how some of my colleagues around the table have felt I've stepped on their toes by maybe things I've said at the table and emails that I've sent. And this might be another time then someone might feel that way. But I wanted to point out that as Mr. Carruthers said in the beginning, the intended allocation for the watershed function was $2 million. It's now at $750,000. So just, you know, and I'm saying with this with respect. I know that tact isn't always my strongest point, but for instance, Quamachin Lake, it's also in the region. It's in trouble. North Cowichan is committed, particularly with the agreement with Rowing Canada, to do what we can to assist that watershed. We're not coming to the board, even though we're paying a lot of that $750,000 on requisition, to ask that it come out of this pot. That would be unrealistic. How that will go in the future, I don't know. But it seems to me that Ms. Miller's recommendation about continuing grant and aid as it is really important, and I don't know the rationale, and I hope that, I mean, I can't even be at those meetings to hear it, the AC meetings, about the cut to the Shawnigan Basin, because I have, North Cowichan meets at that time, so I can't be there. I know I can't vote on it, but it just seems to me that this is something our region wants, and we have to begin to work together. Oh gosh, not Samat. Yeah, I forget the other part, Ya Sakwa, from yesterday, which is about for the health of the watershed. For the health of the watershed. So there will be some people, as there are now, who pay disproportionately in the region. But that's regions. Individually, I think we're all having to stand up as individual taxpayers, no matter what class we're in, because we all impact and are impacted by the watershed. And we are going to have to stand up in history, if however long that goes, on this decision that we're making. So I'm really hopeful that that what's happening now will continue to happen, so that the Shawnigan Basin Society and other groups that are working to inform our staff will be able to continue to do their work and leverage their work. So I know Aaron's frowning, I'm
just trying to find clarity in my mind.
So what I'm saying is I hope that the directors at the EAC will consider reinstating the Shawnigan Basin's funding, at least in this interim time. It's none of my business, I know, but I can't sit here without just saying that.
Okay, I appreciate the perspective. I do want us to try and focus on the actual item on the agenda, which is impacted by that, but it is a separate function. I have Director Nicholson, I saw Director Smith, so Director Nicholson.
Okay, this is going to challenge your ability to find clarity, Mr. Chair. And I have a bit of a little dissertation, because for me, water is sort of the number one thing that reasons I sit here. And I would say, wow, we have $750,000 that the community has supported us spending to protect our water and watersheds, to help us make, I think, really key changes that are necessary in the way we care for our water if we're going to be successful. So yesterday, as Director Acton mentioned, many of us participated in a Cowichan Watershed Board event. And once again, I was reminded and indeed witnessed the importance of the partnership we are building with the Cowichan people. So the strength and patience of the Cowichan, that wrongs will be righted, always incredibly impressing to me. Their deep cultural commitment to caring for the land and water on which we all depend. So the Cowichan Watershed Board, in my mind, is the most important strategic initiative that the CVRD has undertaken. I applaud the board who created its creation. This is a partnership that we cannot afford to fail. So I don't really care where the $50,000 comes from, but to me, it is not adequate for what they are doing to indicate that we are supportive of that partnership. And so that money needs to be protected over the long term and increased probably. So to carry on the notion of the Cowichan Watershed Board, for the past 9 years of its existence, with no authority at all, it has accomplished a great deal towards building awareness in the community about the state of our water, involving the community and building trust. Trust is a really important word here for moving forward together and setting important targets to guide investments and projects. All this for $50,000 a year, which they've gone on to leverage hundreds of thousands of dollars from sources outside the region, which have come to us, that's economic development in action. And now we have $750,000, albeit for the whole region, but what an opportunity. So while the Cowichan Watershed Board is not an NGO, it is a formal partnership. We need to remember that. We can't lump them in with the stewardship groups. There's something special and important. So, but more importantly, I believe we can learn from their approach, and they're focused on involving and working hand in hand with the community. In the case of water, which we have incredible community resources, as we heard from the public input, their stewardship groups are doing great work. We have really skilled technical people out in the community that volunteer their time. And so cooperating and coordinating with the community stretches precious dollars and makes achieving our water goals possible and lasting. More people are actively caring. So the staff report today, although it talks about partnerships, I do not believe it reflects truly a community partnership model. So I'm looking for a new way of doing business as we set up this water protection service. one where the Cowichan Valley Regional District works with the community to devise the program and support its implementation. It's all the same work. All the people out there in the community and all the staff that we have working on water, it's all the same work. We need to leverage both the CVRD and the community's expertise if we're going to make good progress. If we try and do it ourselves, people will just go, you know, there's no point being involved anymore. So I support taking the notion of the first year to develop a plan as was presented. However, I don't think that this will be successful unless, first of all, the plan is developed with strong community engagement. So this idea of a technical committee, there's not enough articulation around what this all means to me. But I think this is not like a technical exercise about water. This is about a steering committee supported by strong community engagement and involvement to ensure everyone's heard and involved in developing the plan. And that's really important. I think we need to get going right away on hiring a staff person that has technical credibility and excellent extension skills so that the community involvement can be supported over the long term. I'll just leave it at that. You know, trust and credibility aren't built overnight, and I think we need to really get someone on board that can fill that role sooner rather than later. Now I've lost my notes. Just a minute. The third thing I think is that the proposed initiatives for this year, which I wrote them down somewhere, hydrometric program, water quality, and so forth, I think they need to be put on hold. So in the budget, those initiatives are presented, and there is no understanding around them about the long-term costs of maintaining those programs. And so they're going to be eating into the precious $750,000. So I think it's important that the plan we develop acknowledge that those are the right things to be doing, and before we commit to that. And that's one of the ways that you build community trust, because you involve them in that decision. You don't decide you're going to go, you know, do a hydrometric program without them understanding and agreeing to that. And then the final thing is about this issue of community watershed groups. I think that we have to recognize their value and support their existence. Cowichan Region has high public support and engagement in water and watersheds, thanks to those people on the ground who for the last, I don't know, hundreds of years, at least decades, have been planting trees, rescuing fish, telling stories to their neighbors about the water. You can't pay for that kind of commitment through public relations or communications programs, you know, and we're at risk of losing the support if we don't appear to need their help. We need to invest to develop that potential. It's going to save money, leverage public participation, and compliance for water policies. And it's no good throwing money at the NGOs. And so notionally allocating $60,000 that's just tokenism. What we need to do is to actually support their involvement and work with them together. And, you know, I would anticipate if we do that, we will find that it would be better value for the buck if we invest more than $60,000 by, you know, 4 times over the long run if we have really great functioning stewardship groups modeled on the Cowichan Watershed Board over the long term. So, yeah, that was kind of a long dissertation, sorry. Finished.
Thank you. I'll just move on the speakers list and let that sink in. Director Smith.
Through the chair, so that's a pretty hard act to follow. Coming from the north, we also have an opportunity, I think, as this process goes forward, to do catch-up. The South has been very, very fortunate with the Cowichan Watershed Board, and coming from an area where we haven't had those opportunities brought forward to our areas. We do have catch-up, and we need to be looking at that. I have a bit of a struggle moving the grant and aid for the Cowichan Watershed Board from the environmental initiatives into this new budget, because all of a sudden one group of the NGOs is being looked at, and that wasn't necessarily what was put on the table for the other NGO groups. I think that we shouldn't be singling out one group to receive money in this new budget. I think it should remain in the 131. And then once the recommendations have been made, then as all the other groups be included, be moved over. And this way, we are not putting one group ahead of any of the other groups.
Thank you. Fair comment. I'll go to Mr. Carruthers, and I'll remind the committee that I don't have anybody else on my speakers list. I do have a couple of comments, though, after Mr. Carruthers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just in response to Director Smith, and I think somebody had made the comment earlier, the Cowichan Watershed Board is not an NGO. Technically it is. The Cowichan Watershed Board is a partnership. It's a partnership that this board of the day committed to, in close partnership with Cowichan tribes. It is an investment in a partnership, and it is a different entity than the other NGOs who are self-created, and I'm not distinguishing in terms of value or anything else. I'm just making the distinction that this board committed to the Cowichan Watershed Board, and so we have as staff look at it differently in terms of a partnership. It has significant impacts with our relationship with Cowichan tribes, and I don't think can be looked at the same as potentially some of the other stewardship groups. I just wanted to highlight that.
Thank you. And I've got Director Wilson, but I just wanted to get a couple of questions in just to help frame my understanding. And this actually goes, I had a similar question, thank you, I'll get you on my list, to Director Smith, and I grappled with it, so I just want to kind of go through my thought process and maybe ask questions of staff. This is a regional function which would be allocated funding through every municipality and electoral area in the regional district on an assessment basis. Presently, the North End, for example, has a very active group, but has never had the formality maybe of the Shawnigan Basin Society, or certainly not of Cowichan Watershed Board. However, as we tried and failed, frankly, in the previous term municipally and Ladysmith to form a round table around watersheds, we did look to the Cowichan as an example. I initially had the same question because the funding for the watershed protection function is regional, that I had to grapple with this year of funding it regionally without it actually participating in watershed issues to the north or to the south, in fact, but more core around the central Cowichan issues. Now that extends all through many electoral areas and municipalities, so I do understand that. So I guess my question was, under Function 131, how does the funding of the Cowichan Watershed Board in terms of allocations from each of the individual areas flow through to Cowichan Watershed Board? Is that truly regional as it sits today? Thank you. So I just wanted to have clarity that moving it to it doesn't impact how it's funded. However, I do agree with Director Smith that there's a challenge there to bring that capacity level up. So I just want to explain my justification in my own rationale was that the Cowichan Watershed Board is the example, not just regionally, not just Vancouver Island, not just provincially, but nationally, on how to work on water stewardship. And thankful to that investment that was made. Director Nicholson alluded to it almost a decade ago now, and really preceded that, but the formation has been in line for a better part of a decade. To be the instructive piece and the guides that will help us establish similar kind of structures throughout the regional district. I'm not saying that we would task the Cowichan Watershed Board with that broader responsibility, but as we look at the issues in the north and the south and the west, that group is best tasked with being an assistant as far as growing the function. And just one final comment on the function in general. And I do agree with Director Nicholson and Director Marsh. From what I could glean, I have a similar perspective on those issues, but I do think that because of some of the challenges around technical capacity, the skill level, I did, on multiple read-throughs specifically on this function, support that transition year of developing that capacity internally. Although I do want to point out that something that did stick out to me was the community engagement piece. I support technical advisory groups which pull from the communities, the retired people, the people who have technical background, and I'm assuming that they would be included, hopefully, in that terms of reference, but that would come back to the board to develop. Once we've done that, I do have trouble going to the broader community that isn't as professionally skilled to influence the work plan development for the function, because then we may get some political pressure, if you will, that may be misguided from a scientific point of view. So I'm just saying that I essentially support the transition year work plan that's being presented here. I can't comment on the specific issue about the other function for Shawnigan Basin Society. I think that's a different discussion, but I just wanted to get some points in of where I'm thinking through, and I'll go to Director Wilson now as next on the speakers list. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to bring a little bit of levity to a very serious discussion. There's a great danger that I'm going to get crotchety because my blood sugar levels are going down. So could I move that we go for lunch?
Mr. Barry.
Mr. Chair. Thank you. Mr. Chair, I'm in the same agreement with Director Wilson. Really, it depends how long this discussion is going to go on right now. If you're going to finish in about 5 minutes or so, I have a motion because you're going to have to adjourn this meeting to reconvene after today's board meeting. So it's a little more involved than just lunch.
Just a quick question, Mr. Barry, though. Are we not going to have challenges on the board meeting without having the resolutions complete from regional services? Does that affect staff's scheduling at all in terms of budget? That's fine? Okay, thank you. So if it's the committee's pleasure, we could break now, or we could just try and get through this one item. I just think there's going to be... Okay, I think if the board, if we have a motion, Mr. Barry, do we actually vote on that, or do we just...
Yes, you would have to
Okay.
vote on this, that the meeting be adjourned to reconvene following the conclusion of today's board meeting.
All right, so that's been moved by Director Wilson, seconded by Director Kuhn. All those in favor? Opposed? None opposed. Motion carries. We'll reconvene after today's board